Part 1 of 2 essays on military history, strategy, and tactics, Mountain Warfare, 1909, and Naval Strategy, 1917. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. 2 essays on military history, strategy, and tactics, Mountain Warfare, 1909, and Naval Strategy, 1917, by various authors. Part 1. Mountain Warfare. Some Principles of Frontier Mountain Warfare. The saying that there is no new thing under the sun is as applicable to military affairs as to those of everyday life, for it is fully admitted that the principles underlying all strategy and tactics, whether of mountain or other warfare, are immutable. But though the principles of strategy and tactics are unchanging, organization, formations, and minor items of procedure must be continually amended to meet ever-varying circumstances, and in addition, each campaign possesses special characteristics demanding further modification. There are in fact no invariable rules in the conduct of war, and whilst formalism is harmful in all matters, in military operations it is disastrous. An army relying on an established code of rules will often defeat itself in their application, and even if this disaster is avoided, the enemy will soon become aware of the methods in vogue, and will so frame his tactics as most advantageously to counteract them. Each problem, great and small, each set of circumstances, must therefore be considered on its merits. Principles must be applied in the solution, not rules and strategy, tactics, organization, equipment, and other matters arranged accordingly. It is in this spirit that the problems of Indian frontier warfare should be approached. General considerations. The strength and organization of a force destined to undertake operations against the transborder clans of the Indian frontier is naturally conditioned by the physical features of the area, by its fertility, and by the numbers, character, organization, and armament of its inhabitants. It has been truly said that in war every available man should be employed, for one can never be too strong. But this aphorism is always qualified by the number of men that can be fed in the district which is to form the seat of war. The problem of the numbers to be used against the Pathan tribes is, therefore, by no means easy of solution, for, as a great French king said of Spain, in mountainous countries possessing, as does the Indian borderland, few natural resources, but inhabited by a hardy though scanty population, large armies risk starvation, small are in danger of defeat. The tribesmen of the northwest frontier are brave and inured to fatigue and hardship. A considerable number have been trained in our Indian Army, and these have some knowledge of tactics and acquaintance with British methods. The clansmen possess no artillery, but in other respects are fairly well armed, and, owing to the cheap sale of rifles and ammunition in Afghanistan, are daily becoming more formidable in this respect. They suffer, however, from 2 grave military faults, lack of discipline and cohesion, and at present would, it is believed, be unable to mass against any one of several columns invading their fastnesses. They would more probably be content merely to defend their own valleys and homesteads, rather than attempt to defeat in detail the divided forces of an invader operating from exterior lines. It would seem, then, that in a campaign in the Indian borderland, British troops would be justified in undertaking a concentric invasion from several localities. Certain advantages may also be claimed for this policy. The road space occupied in these pathless regions by a large force moving in one line is so great that, as was demonstrated in Sir W. Lockhart's advance from Shunawari in 1897, the rear of the column will be several days' march behind the leading troops. In these circumstances, not only will risk of defeat in detail be even greater than in the case of concentric invasion, for small columns can better exercise mutual support than can a large force moving in a restricted valley, but the length of the convoy train and the seeming strength of the force will be a direct temptation to the tribesmen to avoid battle and have recourse to guerrilla warfare. Besides, if small columns are employed, the whole country will be, in the first instance, overrun, and the enemy may, on account of the apparent weakness of the various detachments, take heart of grace and fight. This, after all, is what is most desired, for the aim is always to attain rapid and decisive victory, and so end the campaign. An argument against convergent invasion is that, since it may be necessary to use more than one line of communication, not only will the employment of larger numbers be necessary, but more transport animals, the provision and care of which really constitutes the main difficulty in frontier warfare, will be required. This drawback may, however, be mitigated by opening only one line of communication along the easiest route, the other detachments moving as flying columns, until the heart of the district is reached, when their surplus animals can be transferred to line of communication duties. Strength and organization of columns. In deciding the strength of a column for an expedition against the northwest frontier tribesmen, the first requisite, having regard to the foregoing considerations, is to limit numbers, that, in the topographical conditions likely to be met, the force can, as an entirety, make a march of reasonable length, let us say 8 or 10 miles. Assuming that the column will move at an average rate of about 2 miles per hour, that, in order to avoid risk of disaster, it is, as a rule, desirable for the main force not to march before dawn, and to be in camp by dusk, and that 10–12 hours of daylight are available, it is clear that the road space occupied must not, for a 10-mile march, exceed 10 to 14 miles. That is to say, the numbers that can fulfill this condition on a narrow track amount to about 4,500 fighting men, carrying 3 days' rations on the person, and 5 days on transport animals. Suppose that 4 such columns are destined to invade the Afridi Tirah. The Afridis are said to possess 25,000 to 30,000 fighting men, and if it be assumed that 2/3 of these have breech-loading rifles, and that the whole mass is unlikely to attack any 1 or even 2 columns, the largest hostile gathering that a British detachment may expect to meet is 6,000 to 8,000 men, of whom 4,500 to 5,500 may be well armed. A column of 4,500 disciplined troops need not, therefore, fear reverse. The composition of a column is regulated by the topography of the area of operations, but the following example will show how the allotment of troops may be determined. As basis for calculation, a mixed brigade organized for independent action may be taken. Footnote 1. 1 British infantry battalion, 3 native infantry battalions, 1/2 British field hospital, 1 1/2 native field hospitals, 1 field post office, brigade supply column. End footnote. To these troops may be added a squadron of Siladar cavalry, if the country is suitable to its action, and a mountain battery, which, together with the infantry, form a handy force of the 3 arms. But the column is still weak in infantry, on which the brunt of the fighting will necessarily fall, and possesses no technical troops for road-making, etc. Both requirements may be fulfilled by the addition of a pioneer battalion, or, since some hold that sappers and miners are more economical than pioneers, a battalion of British infantry or of Gurkhas, and a company of sappers and miners may be included. It now only remains to give the troops an ammunition column, the necessary staff, certain additional medical and administrative details, and the force, 1 infantry brigade, organized for independent action, 1 squadron, 1 mountain battery, 1 British battalion, 1 company sappers and miners, etc., will be complete and adequate for its purpose. Marches and protection. A body of troops moving in an enemy's country is liable to be attacked at any time, and from any direction, and must therefore always take measures for the protection of its front, flanks, and rear. In warfare in civilized and highly developed countries, when the enemy's object is rather to defeat the fighting force than to harry the convoy, and when troops can march on broad frontages, the protection given by bodies of cavalry with horse artillery, flung far to front and flanks, and supported, if necessary, by infantry, is usually adequate. But when the line of march leads along a single file track, winding through narrow valleys and over rugged mountains, when the column, compared to its strength, occupies an inordinate length of roadway, and is therefore especially vulnerable to flank attack, and when the enemy, or at any rate a portion of his warriors, prefer plunder of baggage to pitched battles, other measures to safeguard the force must be taken. Flank guards can rarely make their way over the steeply scarped hills enclosing the northwest frontier valleys, and since the advance guard can, in such conditions, effect no more than the clearance of the valley in which it is moving, it becomes necessary to adopt a sedentary form of protection for the flanks of the force. This consists of pickets, posted along the route, in localities commanding approaches to the roadway, or from which the enemy can fire on the column. These pickets, together with the advanced and rear guards, secure the movement of the remaining troops. They are, as a rule, found by the units composing the advanced guard, and withdraw under the supervision, and, if necessary, with the assistance of the rear guard. The order of march of a column in border, as in other campaigns, is conditioned by the proximity, strength, and probable action of the enemy, by the topography of the district to be traversed, by the object to be obtained, and by the composition of the force. The first duty of the staff officer, to which is confided the drafting of orders for a march, will therefore be, by personal observation and from intelligence and other reports, to find out as much as possible of the country, and of the enemy's dispositions and probable tactics. Armed with this information, he will be in a position to arrange the order of march of his column according to the circumstances of the case. When the enemy, for instance, is in force in the vicinity, and his actions, such as throwing up of entrenchments, harassing camp in large numbers, imply that he will offer vigorous resistance to the advance, it is probable that the baggage and supply columns will be best parked, under sufficient guard, either in the camp or in some other locality easy of defence, whilst the remainder move off in preparatory formation for action. If the clansmen are reported to be inclined to dispute the advance in force, but are some distance from the camp, the most suitable order of march may be deduced as follows. The enemy being in strength, the column should move in compact formation and deliberately, the advanced guard being pushed only so far forward as to secure the troops from surprise, and as few road pickets sent out as may be, in order that the fighting force may be reduced as little as possible. The method of posting and withdrawing pickets will not materially differ from that which will be described later. The tribesmen being known to be in force and prepared to resist, it follows that the bulk of the fighting men must be at the head of the column, and, as the advanced guard will be near the remainder, it need be only sufficiently numerous to ensure that the duties of protection are adequately performed. Suppose the tribesmen 5 miles distant, and that as a rough basis for calculation 2 companies can secure about 1½ to 2 miles of roadway, then about 3 companies will be required for picketing. If 3 companies be added for other purposes, the advanced guard infantry should be of sufficient strength. The advanced guard will require a proportion of technical troops for road making and repair, and for this purpose 2 companies of pioneers, or the bulk of a company of sappers and miners, may be allotted. Cavalry are not, it is considered, in place with an advanced guard moving in an enclosed and intricate country, nor, since the main body will be close behind, need any special medical details be included. Whether artillery should be allotted is a more open question. In favor of placing guns with the advanced guard, it can be argued that they may be of assistance in clearing the hills to be occupied by pickets or vanguard. Against their inclusion, it may be argued that artillery ammunition will necessarily be scarce, owing to the difficulty of carriage, and should only be employed when an advantageous opportunity for inflicting loss occurs, but that advanced guard commanders are prone to make too much use of their guns. On the whole, when the advanced guard is not far from the main body, it would seem that the inclusion of guns in the former is unnecessary. The organization and order of march of the main body may be as under. It is clear that the numbers available for action will be those left over after suitable deduction has been made for baggage and rear guards. These, therefore, must first be allotted. Light-duty men, officers' servants, cooks, etc., should suffice to secure the regimental transport, and for policing the drivers, but the supply column, hospitals, and reserve ammunition requires special escorts, and perhaps 1 company each may be adequate for the 2 first mentioned, and 1 or 2 companies for the ammunition. The strength and composition of the rear guard is the next item, and this is regulated by its function of supervision of the retirement of the pickets. Such being the case, it appears that in no circumstances should a large force be detailed as a rear guard. There is not space in a narrow valley for a strong rear guard to maneuver, so that it will merely afford the enemy a good target, without corresponding advantage. Besides, the rear guard can, if necessary, be continually reinforced by incoming pickets. A rear guard, then, should rarely include more than 4 companies of infantry, and, in the circumstances under consideration, may be weaker. Though cavalry may be useful for the delivery of a counter-attack, the horses afford an easy mark, whilst its presence with the rear guard may cause the enemy to keep to the hills instead of descending into the valley, where they will be more vulnerable. Cavalry, it seems, should therefore not be added to the rear guard infantry. Mountain guns may be of assistance to pickets in distress, or in the delivery of a counter-attack, but they should, both for their own security and to prevent waste of ammunition, be kept well back. In the present case, the rear guard is not likely to be harassed, so no artillery need to be included. A rear guard does not require technical troops, but some hospital riding mules, etc., may be allotted for rapid transference of wounded. The total deductions from the fighting force of the column will therefore be: advanced guard, 6 companies infantry, bulk of 1 company S&M. Escorts, etc., 3 or 4 companies infantry. Rear guard, 2 or 3 companies with machine guns. In all, about 1½ battalions, 1 company sappers and miners. There remain 3½ battalions, 1 mountain battery, 1 squadron, and the administrative services at disposal. The order of march of the main body can now be dealt with. Perhaps half a battalion may move in front, then the mountain battery, which should not require a special escort, next the 3 battalions. After these may follow the reserve ammunition, the hospitals, the second-line transport, with B echelon, first-line transport of all troops, except the advanced and rear guards, and then the supply column. At the tail of the main body may move the B echelon of the advanced and rear guards, so as to be readily available in case any troops belonging to either are obliged to bivouac outside camp. And finally, since they are unlikely to be able to undertake effective pursuit, may come the cavalry, so as to be at hand in case they are required to assist the rear guard to counter-attack, by charging any tribesmen who have ventured into the valley. Though B-echelon first-line transport of the advanced and rear guards is placed at the end of the column, it is considered that all troops should be so equipped that they can be independent of camp and transport for at least 2, and better skill, for 3 days. It is a lesser evil to carry an extra, but in some degree decreasing load, even if it prejudices mobility, than to starve or run undue risk of sickness from cold and damp. The next case to be considered will be when the enemy is not in great force, and is more likely to harass than to seriously resist the advance of the column. In such circumstances, the main objects will be to complete, as rapidly as may be, the proposed march, whilst inflicting on the enemy, should he give the opportunity, the greatest possible loss. Since the distance is to be quickly traversed, and because a road picket takes some time, even as much as an hour, to secure and establish itself on a hill, it follows that, unless risk is to be run of the march of the main body being delayed, the advanced guard must precede the main body by at least 1 hour, and may even move off in the twilight which precedes dawn. This settled, the composition of the advanced guard may be dealt with. If it is proposed to make a 10-mile march, then, calculating from the data previously mentioned, about 1 battalion will be sufficient to picket the roadway. To this force some 4 companies may be added, so as to leave a good margin for securing the campsite and for unexpected contingencies. Technical troops will, as before, be required, and, as the advanced guard will be some way from the main body, a section of mountain artillery may be included. Neither cavalry nor special medical units seem necessary. The composition of the advanced guard may therefore be 1½ battalions infantry, 1 section mountain battery, the bulk of 1 company sappers and miners. As already stated, before deciding on the order of march of the main column, the deductions to be made for escort and rear guard duties must be fixed. Light duty men, etc., should suffice to secure the regimental transport, 3 companies to safeguard the reserve ammunition, hospitals, and supply column, whilst the mountain battery hardly needs a special escort. In respect of the rear guard, in the case under consideration, it is possible that the pickets may be harassed as they withdraw. The strength of the rear guard may therefore amount to 4 companies of infantry with machine guns, and 1 section mountain artillery, with some ambulance riding mules, etc., in addition. The total deductions for purposes of protection from the fighting force of the column, therefore, amount to infantry 2 battalions, 3 companies, artillery 2 sections, sappers and miners 1 company, and there remains for disposal infantry 2 battalions, 5 companies, artillery 1 section, cavalry 1 squadron, besides various administrative units. No serious opposition being expected to the march of the column, the comfort of the troops may be considered in regulating the order of march. As before, and for the same reasons, the cavalry and B-echelon first-line transport of the advanced and rear guards and of the picketing troops may march at the tail of the main body. It should hardly be necessary to place, in addition, a body of infantry at the end of the column, but if desired, the remaining 4 companies of the battalion furnishing the rear guard may move immediately in front of or behind the cavalry. The rest of the fighting force can march at the head of the main column, followed by the reserve ammunition, hospitals, B-echelon, first-line transport, with the second-line transport, and then the supply column. In circumstances where little or no resistance is expected to the forward movement of a column, but serious opposition to the withdrawal of pickets and to the march of the rear guard, the following modification will be necessary in the order of march just dealt with. The strength, composition, and time of march of the advanced guard need only be altered by the deduction of, say, one section of sappers and miners, and perhaps, too, the withdrawal of the mountain guns. The escorts, etc., of the non-fighting portions of the main column may remain as before suggested, as may the strength and composition of the rear guard. The order of march of the main column will, however, require transposition somewhat as follows. Since the principal opposition will take the form of pursuit by the enemy, the bulk of the fighting troops should move in rear of the main column, so as to be in position to undertake the offensive if required. The units may therefore march as follows: 2 companies of infantry, the supply column, the B echelon first-line transport, except of the advanced and rear guards, with the second-line transport, the hospitals, the reserve ammunition, B echelon first-line transport of the advanced and rear guards, the rest of the infantry, less 4 companies, the remainder of the artillery, 1 section of sappers and miners, the cavalry, and finally 4 companies. Footnote 2. First-line transport is usually divided into 2 echelons, A and B. The former includes ammunition reserve, entrenching tools, water, signaling, and medical equipment. The latter, blankets, rations, and cooking pots, etc. End note. End of Part 1. Part 2 of 2 essays on military history, strategy, and tactics, Mountain Warfare, 1909, and Naval Strategy, 1917, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, Mountain Warfare. Action of the advanced and rear guards and of road pickets. Speaking generally, the procedure followed by an advanced guard may be somewhat as follows. Both on account of consideration for its own security, and because hills will thus be more rapidly secured, it is desirable that the positions to be occupied by road pickets should, so far as it is practicable to do so from the valley, be decided some time before the main guard arrives opposite the various localities. It is also understood that considerable latitude is allowed to the picket commander as to the position occupied, and that he is at liberty either to demand reinforcement or to return redundant men to the advanced guard, as occasion may demand. The advanced guard may move in the following order. First, a vanguard of 1 or more companies preceding the remainder by about half a mile, and adapting its formation to the ground. Then the main guard, at the head of which should be the advanced guard commander, his staff officer, the battalion commander of the unit furnishing the leading company, and the company commander. As the troops march up the valley, the advanced guard commander should decide what localities are to be held and in what strength. He should issue his orders to the battalion or company commander, as the case may be, when the pickets should move direct to their positions. Meanwhile, the staff officer should make, in sections, a rough sketch of the positions occupied by the various pickets, which should be numbered consecutively as they move out, the sections of the sketch being sent, as completed, to the officer commanding the rear guard. In addition, to ensure that no picket is overlooked by the rear guard, a double sentry, with a paper showing the number of its picket, should be placed in the roadway beneath the height occupied, and it is the duty of the picket commander to keep in touch with this sentry post. In this manner, the roadway should be picketed until the locality is reached where the column is to halt, when the advanced guard commander should take the usual measures for the security of the camp, for safeguarding the water supply, etc. It has been suggested that an advanced guard should be divided into two portions, advanced guard and the picketing troops, each under a separate leader, the object being to free the advanced guard commander from the work of picketing so that his whole attention can be devoted to tactics. The advanced guard is to clear the hills, which are then to be occupied by pickets. This system does not appear sound, for it necessitates two men doing the work of one, and in practice the advanced guard usually either meets with little or no resistance, or with such serious opposition that picketing is in abeyance. Each picket, when it reaches the position selected by its leader, should entrench, taking especial care to provide head cover so that the enemy may not be easily able to observe the moment of its final withdrawal. Before the last troops of the main column have quitted camp, the rearguard commander should have arranged his force in a series of successive positions, calculated to enable the units to mutually support one another's retirement, as well as to assist, if necessary, the withdrawal of pickets. The guns should, for reasons already given, be kept well back, and this system of successive positions should be continued throughout the march. It is, of course, understood that the main column keeps contact with, and regulates its march by, that of the rearguard. It is sometimes advocated that the camp pickets should, before the column marches off, be relieved by the rearguard, with the object of enabling the pickets to rejoin their units. This arrangement does not appear advantageous. The troops detailed for the relief of the pickets will probably have to move out in darkness and over an unknown area, and though, if the enemy advances during the relief, he will be opposed in double strength, should his attack be delivered later, units who do not know the ground will be placed in positions they will not be able to defend to the best advantage. Besides, the men composing the rearguard, whose functions are in any case sufficiently arduous, will be involved in additional and unnecessary fatigue. The withdrawal of pickets may be carried out on the following principles. When a picket commander sees or receives reports that the rearguard is approaching, he should send the bulk of his picket to a position previously reconnoitered, on the lower slope of the hill, and in the direction of the line of march of the columns, whence the retirement of the remainder can be covered by fire. Whilst on the hill, and especially as the time for withdrawal approaches, the men of a picket should be careful not to show themselves, in order that the enemy may not, by counting heads, be able to divine that retirement has been begun. Similarly, the men left on the hill to the last should, above everything, avoid exposure. When the picket commander sees the rearguard commander, who will usually be with the last troops, and whose presence will be shown by a flag, is opposite his post, he should give the signal for the evacuation of the hilltop, on which the men should creep back, and as soon as they are below the skyline, run down the hill to a position beyond that of their covering party. The withdrawal should then be continued according to the accepted principles until the whole picket has reached the valley, when its leader should report to the rearguard commander, receiving orders whether the picket is to proceed to the main column or to join the rearguard. The rearguard commander should have previously called in the road sentry post marking the locality held by the picket, and the map furnished by the advanced guard will have been of assistance in identifying its position. It is contended that the withdrawal of a picket rests, except in special circumstances, entirely with the picket leader. He is the man on the spot, and can best judge when the retirement should commence. The rearguard commander should rarely attempt to regulate the actions of the pickets, of whose situation he cannot have adequate knowledge, but should exercise general supervision, ready to afford assistance if required. At times, pickets may be able to support one another's movements, but as a rule, a picket will be too fully occupied with its own affairs to be able to render assistance to its neighbors. The above outline of a withdrawal presupposes that hostile pressure is not unduly severe. If the enemy venture to close with the rearguard and pickets, it is submitted that an immediate counterattack should be delivered, the main body being halted. To lose so golden an opportunity of inflicting loss on a volatile foe seems on the one hand unwise, whilst on the other it is surely both undignified and demoralizing to permit savages to hunt British regulars into camp. The delivery of a counterattack is accompanied by some risk, and its success will depend on the aptitude of the rearguard commander for stratagem, for if loss is to be inflicted, the enemy must, as a rule, be trapped. Simple ruses which suggest themselves are either to attempt to attract the tribesmen into the low ground by a bait of ammunition or transport animals, the cavalry, guns, and part of rearguard infantry being previously concealed in position from which they can take advantage of any mistake the enemy may commit, and the retirement of pickets stopped as soon as the attack is delivered. Or 2 or more pickets, which have been previously reinforced by troops moving along concealed lines of advance to the hilltops, may feign retirement and attack the tribesmen as they follow over the crest line. If stratagem fails, the column should halt and drive off the enemy, a proceeding which should be repeated until he is taught that to follow up British troops is neither profitable nor advantageous. Attack and defense. Success in war depends in some degree on adaptation of tactics to local conditions, and it is therefore clear that to attain rapid success against the inhabitants of the northwestern frontier, a knowledge of their tactics is required, and that, whilst the British aims are pursued with unswerving determination, their probable movements must be met and defeated. The tribesmen, like most savages, are only really formidable when one is running away from them. They fight well in positions strongly fortified, and with flanks secure, but being without the discipline or cohesion to meet envelopment, are much influenced by pressure against their flanks. Pathans are fearful of artillery, and do not, as a rule, seriously resist a determined advance, preferring the easier and less dangerous enterprise of harassing the retirements which they believe are an inevitable corollary to forward movements, or of attacking isolated detachments whose operations they have observed from their hilltops. They are suspicious of ambuscades, except when excited in pursuit, and are not prone to accept battle unless surprised. Like other people, they shoot well when not themselves under effective fire, and when shooting into a valley where the strike of the bullet can be observed, their fire is accurate. On the other hand, owing to their relatively defective armament and to lack of ammunition, tribal fire, as a rule, lacks volume. The tribesmen skirmish well and move quickly over their hills, but rarely, except when engaging a small force or by night, attack in mass. On the other hand, they often crowd their defensive positions with men. They are said to dislike being overlooked by their opponents, and therefore do not care to attack uphill, but will at times try to rush a detachment with the object of capturing rifles and ammunition. The fact that a proportion of the men possess only inferior firearms renders possible resort to shock tactics, especially when roused to a pitch of fanaticism. Pathans are partial to night operations, probably because they believe that there is little fear of interference after dark. Their enterprises are usually on a small scale, but night attacks in force are possible. Their inadequate clothing and the cold of the early morning, however, usually forces them to seek shelter as the night wears on. From the above description it will be seen that British troops, so long as they observe the ordinary principles of war, have nothing to fear from the tribesmen. But it is to be remembered that unless stratagem is intended, the offensive is the general rule in tribal warfare, for the enemy construes a defensive position as a sign of fear, and becomes correspondingly elated. The composition of forces dispatched on reconnaissance and minor punitive expeditions requires careful consideration. Columns composed of men drawn from many different infantry units are inherently weak, so that, in all operations, complete units, so far as they are required, should be employed, cavalry being added when local conditions are favorable. Artillery will generally be necessary, as well as a proportion of technical troops, but the strength of columns should, within limits of safety, be low in order to ensure mobility and to encourage resistance. The military value of the enemy must not, however, be underestimated. The main object of all operations is to quickly attain a decisive success. To this end, the tribesmen must be induced to stand and fight, with the purpose of inflicting casualties on them. It is to be remembered that the enemy can, less easily than the British, afford losses, especially of arms. Commanders, without being prodigal of their men's lives, need not, therefore, be afraid of incurring casualties, especially when there is likelihood that the enemy will suffer loss to at least an equal extent. If the tribesmen's losses are heavy, those of the British troops will probably be considerably less. Close fighting is all to the advantage of trained soldiers. As has been stated, the clansmen will rarely commit themselves to battle in conditions favorable to the British, unless they can be outwitted or surprised. Night operations may therefore frequently be necessary, having special regard to the fact that from their hilltops the enemy will overlook all maneuvers. As the natives are not often abroad in the early morning, surprise at dawn will not present unusual difficulties. The enveloping form of tactics, when the enemy is attacked both in front and flank, is as effective in tribal as in other warfare. But owing to the topographical advantages enjoyed by the tribesmen, it will be necessary to hold them closely in frontal attack, and so distract their attention from outflanking movements. This may be possible, for they fight with confidence when behind cover. Mere frontal attack is likely to be at once costly and ineffective. Hence, if neither envelopment nor night operations are practicable, resort must be had to such stratagems as a feigned retirement, or a bait of transport animals to tempt the Pathans from their hills. Though the possibility of tribal counterattack by shock must not be lost sight of, the British advantage in training and armament should enable a central general reserve to be dispensed with, the object being to so dispose the troops as to ensure envelopment. Good information and staff work and a sound system of intercommunication will, moreover, if all ranks are imbued with the spirit of mutual support, go far to ensure success. Commanders, especially of small forces, should remember that hesitation will be quickly observed by the enemy, but a bold front and ready stratagem will soon cause him to lose heart. When a post or isolated detachment requires assistance, aid can often be most rapidly and effectively given by application of such indirect pressure as will tend to divert the enemy's attention. In minor tactics, whilst taking every advantage of the cover afforded by features of ground, troops must beware of seeking shelter in hollows or nullahs, places which will assuredly have been marked by the enemy's riflemen, so that their occupation will rarely escape punishment. In attack, infantry units, whilst securing their flanks, should advance up salients, taking care to afford one another mutual fire assistance. Supports and local reserves should be pushed as near to the firing line as the shape of the ground will permit. But at times reserves may be able to effectively support the troops in front by covering fire, from suitable positions behind or on the flanks of the line of advance. Fire should be reserved until units have closed on the enemy, the object being to prevent the early evacuation of a position after having caused a few casualties at long range. As the enemy's fire, though likely to be accurate, will probably lack volume, resort need not be had to widely extended formations. To gain ground, and when assaulting, the procedure outlined in the training manuals requires no modification. Artillery should be handled with discretion, and should be on its guard against the tendency to open fire whenever a target is seen. Its aim should be not to evict, but to hold the enemy to his sangars, and to inflict loss when he retreats. The steep forward slopes of hills will enable fire to be continued until the infantry has closed on the tribesmen, but oblique rather than frontal fire should be employed. It is, of course, important to ensure close intercommunication between infantry and artillery. In tribal, as in other warfare, unless the enemy is completely enveloped, efficient pursuit is necessary to set the seal on victory. Pursuit can, at first, probably be best undertaken by the enveloping wings, artillery cooperating to head the enemy off in the required direction, whilst the cavalry press forward. A portion of the artillery should, therefore, move with the outflanking wings, keeping as near as possible to the firing line. Pathans, familiar with the country, and confident that they have everything to gain and but little to lose by such tactics, favor the harassing of troops as they withdraw from heights or along valleys. Though it may be taken as a maxim that there will be no pursuit if the enemy has, in any recent fighting, been adequately punished, the conditions may have been such that casualties could not be inflicted. In these circumstances, the clansmen must surely not be permitted to embarrass the British movements, and must be convinced that pursuit is both dangerous and unprofitable. Mere counter-attack, when the enemy is not surprised, is likely to lead to no advantage, but a few skillfully laid ambushes will soon discourage his zeal for pursuit. Should he, however, persist in following up the troops, counter-attack should at once be made, and the retirement discontinued. The enemy, it is to be remembered, will, as a rule, offer the greatest opportunity of inflicting loss when he follows up a retirement, and in such operations the aim must be rather to cause rather than to avoid casualties. All withdrawals should be prearranged and systematic, flanks being securely held, and the principle of mutual support observed. But formalism must be avoided, and procedure must never be permitted to become so stereotyped that the enemy will be able to confidently anticipate the movements of the troops. Men must beware of entering nullahs, or depressions of any kind, until the further edge has been secured, and when on a hilltop the provision of such cover as will conceal the headdress is of importance. Transport animals should be clear of the fighting troops before retirement is begun. If the object is to slip away from the enemy, the retirement should be made at a time when movement is not expected. When a valley is to be swept in course of punitive operations, an adequate force should be left to secure the entrance if the column is to leave by this route. Troops, as has already been suggested, should, in respect of ammunition, food, and warm coats, be independent of transport animals, and it should be understood that units are always to be prepared to remain for the night away from camp. The men should be trained to economize water, which is often scarce across the border. Ammunition and rifles being the main objects of tribal ambition, special care should be taken to prevent them from falling into the enemy's hands. Against the northwest frontier clans, the offensive, as usual, is normally the best defensive, but it may sometimes happen that small British forces are temporarily obliged to act on the defensive. In such circumstances, it is to be expected that the enemy will adopt the tactics common amongst savages of seeking the flanks of the troops, both to avoid fire and to obtain the advantages of enfilade. It follows, then, that defensive measures should include all-round protection, whilst a relatively large reserve should be kept ready to attack the hostile levies as soon as any portion comes within charging distance. Experience tends to prove that a compact body of even a section, if well entrenched and supplied with ammunition, has nothing to fear from Pathans, especially when the British leader is animated by the proper spirit of timely offensive. End of Part 2. Part 3 of 2 essays on military history, strategy, and tactics, Mountain Warfare, 1909, and Naval Strategy, 1917, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Mountain Warfare. Camps. It is desirable for a column escorting a large baggage train, and this is essentially the predicament of civilized troops engaged in frontier mountain warfare, to be collected in camp before nightfall, otherwise the enemy may be given unduly favorable opportunities of employing harassing methods. But it does not result that the situation of troops unable for any cause to reach camp is at all desperate. Strong and compact forces adopting the usual precautions can probably in many, if not in most cases, march in safety after nightfall, but small detachments and baggage can rarely do so without undue risk. These, then, should always park and entrench towards nightfall, wherever they may find themselves, when they will have little to fear, for experience, as has been stated, tends to show that even a section securely entrenched and with ample ammunition can hold its own against heavy odds. The form of camp and the nature of the protection adopted depend, as usual, on the topography and on the character of the enemy. A common method is to place transport, etc., within a perimeter occupied by the fighting troops, but this arrangement is by no means invariable, and it may be convenient to form 2 or more camps, or to separate transport from fighting troops. The camp will, as a rule, be located in proximity to water, that is to say, in a valley, and in such circumstances, if it can be sited well under one of the enclosing range of hills, protection from sniping will be afforded from this direction, though the overhanging heights must be securely held. Sometimes a small basin is available for the bivouac, and in this case the troops can, to a great extent, be secured from this favorite tribal device of firing into camp after nightfall. As is the case in all war, the measures taken for the security of a camp include a system of pickets, and in frontier expeditions these are placed all around camp, either on the level or on any commanding heights, within, at any rate, effective rifle range. Pickets may be pushed even further forward, but when so situated must be numerically strong, as they are liable to be rushed, though more for the sake of capturing their arms than with the object of inflicting loss. No picket should be of less strength than one section. All should be entrenched against attack from any direction. Their bearing from camp should also be taken, and they should be in signaling communication with the main body, so that assistance may be requested and dispatched when necessary, or warning given of the approach of the enemy in force. Bombs should be useful adjuncts to picket defense in case the enemy should succeed in forming a lodgment near the sangar. Though a sedentary system of pickets may discover the presence of a large hostile body near camp, and may in some degree check sniping, the latter evil cannot by this means be completely prevented. Tribesmen, especially since they are aware that the British rarely risk troops, other than pickets, outside the perimeter, will often creep in and snipe from the area between the pickets and camp. There seems, however, no valid reason why sniping should be passively tolerated, when it can probably be effectively combated by placing in certain localities between the camp and pickets small patrols of picked men, provided with grass shoes, whose duty will be to stalk and bayonet venturesome marauders. Against this proposal, it has been argued that the British, and especially the European soldiers, are unfit to cope by night with tribesmen, inured from childhood to move silently in darkness over rough ground. The contention is considered to be inadmissible, for though there is, and must be, risk in stalking snipers, picked British soldiers are surely now, as formerly, more than a match for Pathans, in all circumstances when the numbers are fairly even. The form of entrenchment, if any, excavated round the bivouac, is conditioned by the character of the enemy. If he is prone to adopt shock tactics and to attempt to rush the camp under cover of darkness, a ditch to check his charge, backed by a parapet with head cover, will be the most favorable form of defense. But if he is partial merely to harassing methods, such as firing into camp, the perimeter defenses should be calculated to mitigate their effects by providing for all troops trenches well traversed and with parapets both to front and rear. If both forms of attack are possible, parapets with trench and ditch should be made, the trench or ditch being first dug, according as a charge or sniping is most to be feared. Naturally, units protected by high ground on one or more flanks need only make cover so as to secure themselves from the directions from which fire can be delivered. Only infantry should hold the perimeter of a camp, machine guns being placed at the angles, and defenses of each confided to one unit, divided responsibility not being permissible. Supports may, if necessary, be located in entrenchments behind the perimeter, and a homogeneous body of about half a battalion allotted as reserve and given a bivouac near that of the column commander. In case of attack, the duty of cavalry soldiers is to stand to their horses, of artillery to man their guns. To neither, therefore, in normal circumstances, should a portion of the perimeter be confided, and both should be placed within its circumference. At the same time, guns should be disposed in pits or epaulements, that they may sweep ground across which attack is most likely to be made. Or they may be laid so as to search localities where tribesmen may collect prior to delivering an assault. Protection of line of communication. The protection of a line of communication is secured by combination of passive and active measures, though the latter are of the greatest importance. Passive measures include the provision of fortified staging posts, linked up by a series of road pickets, and supplemented by escorts to convoys. The active defense is by means of flying columns. Roughly speaking, it may be said that about 100 men per mile suffice for all protective purposes, and it is assumed that the responsibility of a staging post commandant extends halfway to the posts on either side of his own. The garrison of a staging post must be of sufficient strength and of suitable composition to secure the convoys halting there for the night, to furnish them with police escorts for the next day's march, and, if road pickets are found from the post, to supply these also. Road pickets can either be sent out each day from staging posts, can be permanently located in a succession of blockhouses, or can be semi-permanent, that is to say, can be supplied from a series of minor posts connecting staging centers. In each of the above cases, the same number of men will be required. The first method, by concentrating the troops each evening, makes for their general security, but since pickets must daily, and at fixed hours, move to and from their places, a good deal of fatigue will be imposed on the men, and there will, in addition, be some risk of minor disasters to individual pickets, which may be ambuscaded. Moreover, since the convoys cannot march until the pickets are in position, and as pickets cannot be risked outside the post before sunrise and after sunset, the hours available for the movements of the convoys will be a good deal curtailed. Under the second alternative, a weak cordon is formed, portions of which cannot, owing to the topography, easily render one another support in case any picket is attacked in force. On the other hand, no time will be wasted in posting and withdrawing pickets. The third system is a compromise between the two already mentioned, and seems on the whole to be the most advantageous. If 3 or 4 relatively large posts are placed in dangerous localities, such as valley junctions between staging centers, there will be little or no risk of their capture by the enemy. Since the pickets necessary to watch by day the area between the posts will have but short distances to traverse to reach their positions, the time available for movement of convoys will not be curtailed. And as the ground intervening between two posts will in some degree be overlooked from them, there will be less chance than under the first method of pickets falling into ambuscades. The efficiency of the protection of a line of communication depends, however, on the active, not on the passive measures for its security. Active defense is maintained by flying columns of strength and organization suitable to the character of the enemy and the nature of the country. To these columns is confided the protection of certain areas, an end attained not by inactivity, for the troops should be continually on the move, so that the enemy can never be certain when and where to expect them, but by a vigorous and energetic offensive in whatever directions and efficient service of intelligence reports hostile gatherings. The enemy's movements and projects must, in fact, be anticipated rather than countered when in course of execution. Defense of a post. When considering what steps are to be taken for the defense of a post, large or small, the maxim that the offensive is the best defense must be ever prominently before the mind. It follows that the first step after a site has been selected, the water supply secured, and the usual measurements for security taken, should be to set apart as many men as possible for offensive purposes, including reconnaissance. In other words, the strength of the reserve should be calculated from these premises, having due regard to the number of nights in bed required by the whole garrison, and the reserve should not be such men as may be left over after the requirements of passive defense have been fully satisfied. The next item should be the selection of a keep or citadel where stores and ammunition can be placed, and where hospital, headquarters, and a central signaling and communicating station can be located. In this keep may be placed machine or other guns, if available, so arranged that they can sweep approaches to the post, and also, if possible, protect with fire the flanks of picket stations. It will now be time to allocate generally the troops destined for guard and picket duty. These arrangements may be primarily made from the interior of the post, its safety being the first consideration, though for reasons of sanitation, the more space that can be given to troops and convoys, the better. Pickets having been roughly allotted, the plan of defense should be regarded from the enemy's point of view, and the necessary changes made. And finally, the bearings of the picket position should be taken from the keep, and routes to them cleared, in case they should require reinforcement by night. It should only be necessary to keep pickets at their full strength in night time. By day, the bulk of the men should fall back into the interior of the post, an arrangement which would at once facilitate water and food supply, and would also be advantageous from a sanitary point of view. The next duties will be to deal with the general sanitation of the post, and especially of the rest and convoy camps, to mark out the latter and to secure their policing. As time goes on, the post commandant can arrange for improved communication between the keep and pickets, as well as throughout the interior of the enceinte, signposts being erected and the water supply enclosed. End of Part 3. Part 4 of 2 essays on military history, strategy, and tactics, Mountain Warfare, 1909, and Naval Strategy, 1917, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 4, British Navy, Chapter 1, Duties and Responsibilities of the Sea Service. Had I the fabled herb that brought to life the dead, whom would I dare disturb in his eternal bed? Great Grenville would I wake, and with glad tidings make the soul of mighty Drake lift an exulting head. William Watson. When King George returned from the visit he paid to the Grand Fleet in June 1917, he sent a message to Admiral Sir David Beatty, who had succeeded Sir John Jellicoe in the command, in which he said that never had the British Navy stood higher in the estimation of friend or foe. His Majesty spoke of people who reason and understand. But it is certainly true that the work of the sea service during this unparalleled war has never been properly appreciated by many of those who have benefited by it the most. The silent Navy does its work unobserved. The record of its heroism and the services it renders pass unobserved by the multitude. Sometimes it emerges to strike a blow, engage in a scrap, or, it may be, to fight a battle, and then it retires into obscurity again. Its achievements are forgotten. Only the bombardment of a coast town, or the torpedoing of a big ship, which the Navy did not frustrate, is remembered. Such has been the case in all the naval campaigns of the past. Englishmen, who depend upon the Navy for their security and the means of their life and livelihood, as well as for their power of action against their enemies, are but half conscious of what the fleet is doing for them. On this matter, British statesmen, when they speak about the war, almost invariably fail to enlighten them. Who can wonder that people in the Allied countries are still less able to realize that behind all the fighting of their own armies lies the influence of sea power, exercised by the British fleet and the fleets that came one after another into cooperation with it? Without this power of the sea, there could have been no hope of success in the war. As the King said, the Navy defends British shores and commerce, and secures for England and her allies the ocean highways of the world. The purpose of this book is to show how these things are done. On the first day of hostilities, the British Navy laid hold upon the road that would lead to victory. There is no hyperbole in saying that the Grand Fleet, in its northern anchorages, from the very beginning, influenced the military situation throughout the world, and made possible many of the operations of the armies, which could neither have been successfully initiated nor continued without it. But in the early days of August 1914, when, from the war cloud which had overshadowed Europe, broke forth the lurid horrors of the conflict, the situation was extremely critical. What was required to be done had to be done quickly and unhesitatingly, lest the enemy should strike an unforeseen blow. Happily, with faultless knowledge, the strategy of the emergency was realized, and with unerring instinct and sagacity it was applied. The foresight of great naval administrators, and chiefly of Lord Fisher, who had brought about the regeneration of the British Navy, shaping it for modern conditions, was justified 1,000-fold. Never was the need of exerting sea command more urgent than at the outbreak of war. Everything that Englishmen had won in all the centuries of the storied past was involved in the quarrel. Only by mastery of the sea could the country be made secure. Its soil had never been trodden by an invader since Norman William came in 1066. The very food that was eaten, and the things by which the industries and commerce of the country existed, demanded control at sea. If the British Empire was to be safe from aggression, it must be safeguarded on every sea. If England was to set armies in any foreign field of operation, and to retain and maintain them there, with the gigantic supplies they would require, if she was to render help to her allies in men or munitions or anything else, whether they came from England or the United States or any other country, and were landed in France, Russia, Italy, or Greece, or in Egypt, Mesopotamia, or East or West Africa, for the defeat of the enemy, that must be done by virtue of power at sea. Therefore, in this war, as John Holland, writing his Discourse of the Navy in 1638, said of the wars of his time, "The naval part is the thread that runs through the whole woot, the burden of the song, the scope of the text." The moment when the First Fleet, as it was then called, slipped away from its anchorage at Portland on the morning of Wednesday, July 29, 1914, will yet be regarded as one of the decisive moments of history. The initiative had been seized, and all real initiative was thenceforward denied to the enemy. The gage of victory had been won. "Time is everything. 5 minutes makes the difference between a victory and a defeat," said Nelson. "The advantage and gain of time and place will be the only and chief means for our good," Drake had said before him. By a fortunate circumstance which should have arrested the imagination as with a presage of victory, a circumstance arranged 5 months before as the result of a series of most intricate preparations, time and place were both on the British side. The First, Second, and Third Fleets, and the flotillas attached to them, had been mobilized as a test operation and inspected at Spithead by King George on July 20th. The First Fleet had returned to Portland, and the other fleets to their home ports, where the surplus or balance crews of the naval reserves were to be sent on shore. Then had come the now famous order to stand fast, issued on the night of Sunday, July 26, which had stopped the process of demobilization. Dark clouds had shadowed the international horizon. Austria-Hungary had presented her ultimatum to Serbia. She declared war on the 28th. The Second Fleet remained, therefore, in proximity to its reserves of men, and the men were ready to be re-embarked in the Third Fleet. Few men realized at the time the immense significance of the memorable eastward movement of the squadrons from Portland Roads, or of the assembly of those powerful forces at their northern strategic anchorages. Those forces became the Grand Fleet, that unexampled organization of fighting force under command of that fine sea officer, Admiral Sir John Jellicoe. War was declared by Great Britain on August 4th. Successive steps of supreme importance were taken, which, in very truth, saved the cause of the Allies. Disaster and surprise attack were forestalled. The fleet, fully mobilized and growing daily in strength, was already exerting command of the sea, and the safe transport of the expeditionary force to France was assured. Cooperation with the French fleet was immediately established, its cruiser squadron in the Channel and its battle squadrons in the Mediterranean. Fighting episodes were not delayed, but for many months the operations of the Grand Fleet remained shrouded as by a veil, lifted only on rare occasions. Few people knew the tremendous anxieties and responsibility of the British Commander-in-Chief. His vast command of vessels of all classes and uses had to be organized into a mighty fleet, complete in every element: battle squadrons, battle cruiser squadrons, light cruiser squadrons, flotillas and auxiliaries, transports, hospital ships, and every ship and thing that a fleet can require. A whole series of intricate dispositions had to be made. Officers were to be inspired with the ideas of the Commander-in-Chief, and the whole fleet was to be so trained, under squadron and flotilla commanders, that each would know, on the instant, how he should act. If Nelson, in 1789, spent many hours in explaining to his band of brothers his plan for his attack at the Nile, with 14 sail of the line, what must it have been for Sir John Jellicoe to communicate to his officers, and discuss with them, all his plans for every emergency or call for the service of every squadron and ship in his vast command? All this must be realized now. And during the anxious early months of the war, as the winter was drawing near, the great anchorages were as yet unprotected, and safety from hostile submarines could often only be found in rapid steaming at sea. The mining campaign of the enemy had also to be overcome. The anxieties were enormous, and it was only the power of command, the sea instinct, the deep understanding, the readiness to act in moments of extraordinary responsibility, and the resource and professional skill of the commander-in-chief and his staff and officers in command that enabled the tremendous work to be accomplished. While this was in progress, other work of immense significance had been going on. The Admiralty had undertaken a gigantic task of supreme importance with complete success. Great defensive preparations were made in British waters, where all traffic was regulated and controlled. The vast maritime resources of the country were added to the naval service. 2 battleships building for Turkey, another for Chile, and certain flotilla leaders and other craft building in the country were taken over. Officers and men in abundance were ready. The magnificent seafaring populations of the merchant marines and the fisheries were drawn into the naval service, and subsequently the whole mercantile marine was brought under naval control, and for practical purposes was embodied with the Navy. Officers and men of these services showed splendid heroism in situations of terror and responsibility never anticipated. A wide network of patrols was brought into being. The blockade was organized and strengthened, the examination services were set on foot and perfected, and the coast sectors of defense, with their flotillas, were raised to a standard of high efficiency. Minesweepers and net drifters were at work. Every shipyard in the country, and a multitude of engineering and ammunition works, began to buzz with work for the Navy and the mercantile marine. Provision was made for dealing with the raiding cruisers and armed merchantmen of the enemy. At the time, the public knew little or nothing of what was in progress. Imagination fails even now to grasp the magnitude of what was achieved. The naval share in the campaign was of baffling obscurity, while the stage of the war on land became crowded with fighting men, locked in a terrible conflict, which at that time seemed to bode no good to the Allies. After the brush in the Heligoland Bight on August 28, 1914, the fleet was lost to view. Not at first, but slowly, did it become realized that the prognostications of peacetime alarmists had proved baseless. There had been no bolt from the blue, as had been foretold. Neither invasion, nor raid, nor foray was attempted upon British shores, and there was no anxiety about food. There was always, with economy, enough to eat. But popular confidence seemed for a time to be unreasonably disturbed by a record of successive alarming and generally unexplained incidents: the escape of the Goeben and Breslau in the Mediterranean, the sinking of the Aboukir, Cressy, Fogue, Formidable, and other vessels, the depredations of German raiding cruisers on the distant lines of our trade, the bombardment of Hartlepool, Whitby, and Scarborough, and other disquieting episodes. Strange as it may seem, there were people who went about asking, "What is the fleet doing?" Was it not the ancient inspiration of the Navy to seek out the enemy, and to capture or sink or burn his ships wherever they were to be found? Yet there was no battle. The German coast was not attacked. Allied shipping to the value of millions of pounds was being sunk. Why, then, was the Navy inactive? When, later on, the submarine menace assumed formidable proportions, alarm began again to seize upon the newspapers when there was justification only for precaution. The hidden truth was not comprehended. Victories were expected when, owing to the coyness of the enemy's strategy, none were possible. The 7 Years' War, the most successful in British annals, the turning point in British history, the war in which Horace Walpole asked each morning what victory there was to record, began with the disaster of Minorca, followed by the tragedy of Byng. The central facts of naval history were but little known. Yet the Navy was, and is, in truth, all in all to the country, the Empire, and the Allies. Before we enter into the main purpose of this book, in which we shall discover, in several theatres of war, the real nature of sea power, as well as the character and momentous consequences of the antagonism which grew up between England and Germany, we may inquire what services could in reason have been expected from the Navy in the great cataclysm which was about to sweep with destruction over the nations. It would not have been expected to fight a battle every month or even every year, for battles are rare events in naval history. It would not have been expected to attack fortified coasts, though it might do so on occasions, because ships are designed and built to fight at sea. The Navy would not have been expected to forestall every untoward incident. Fish often slip through the net, as raiders have slipped through our guard in this and other wars. Nor, in these days of the stealthy submarine and the blind, death-dealing mine, could the fleet have been expected to remain immune from every misfortune. No one could have expected the Navy to devise a single conclusive defense against the attack of the submarine, any more than it was asked to find an infallible remedy for the effects of gunfire. What we should have expected was that it would make the sea again the protecting wall, as Shakespeare says, of the British Isles, or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands. We should have expected it to safeguard the incoming of the supplies, without which neither the people nor their industries could exist, to be the panoply of all trade and interests afloat, whether in the nature of imports or exports. We should have expected it to deny all external activity to the enemy at sea. We might not have anticipated the advent of the submarine as a pirate commerce destroyer, to shut off his sea-borne supplies, and to exert that noiseless pressure on the vitals of the adversary of which Admiral Mahon speaks, that compulsion whose silence, when once noted, becomes to the observer the most striking and awful mark of the working of sea power. We should have expected the Navy to become the support, in thrusting and holding, of the armies in the field, the shaft to their spearhead, their flank and rearguard also. Inasmuch as the war is world-wide, and we have powerful allies, we should have expected naval influence and pressure to be manifested in the oceans, in the Mediterranean, and, indeed, wherever the enemy is, and the seas are. Finally, we should have expected the Navy to be to the British Empire what it has always been to the Empire's heart, its safeguard from injury and disruption, and the bond that holds it together. Each one of these functions has been executed by a Navy with triumphant success in the war, and history should show that it is executing them now, as the sea service has accomplished them in all the wars of the past. End of Part 4. Part 5 of 2 essays on military history, strategy, and tactics, Mountain Warfare 1909 and Naval Strategy 1917, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 5, British Navy, Chapter 2, The Center of Sea Power. Of speedy victory let no man doubt, our worst works past, now we have found them out. Behold, their navy does at anchor lie, and they are ours, for now they cannot fly. Andrew Marvell, 1653. Of all the theatres of the war, on sea or land, the North Sea is the most important. It is vital to all the operations of the Allies. Command of its waters and its outlets is the thing that matters most. In that sea is the center of naval influence. It is the key of all the hostilities. From either side of it, the great protagonists in the struggle look at one another. There, the great constriction of the blockade is exerted upon Germany. It is the mare clausum, against which she protests. Geography is there in the scales against her. She rebels against British sea supremacy. The freedom of the seas is, therefore, her claim, though she is endeavoring to qualify to be the tyrant of them. Her only outlook towards the outer seas is from the bight of Heligoland, and the fringe of coast behind the East Frisian Islands, or from the Baltic, if her ships pass the Sound, or the Belt, issuing into the North Sea through the Skager Rack. But they cannot reach the ocean except through the North Passage, where the Grand Fleet holds the guard. Only isolated raiders, bent upon predatory enterprise, have stealthily gone that way after nightfall. In the southern gate of the North Sea, through the Straits of Dover and in the Channel, the way is barred. The guns of Dover, the Dover Patrol, and certain other deterrents forbid the enemy to adventure in that direction. The new engines of naval warfare, the mine, submarine, airship, and aeroplane, found their first and greatest use in the North Sea. Only by employing craft which hide beneath the water, and, on rare occasions, by destroyers which seek the cover of darkness for local forays, have the Germans been able to exert their efforts in any waters outside the North Sea. At the beginning of the war they had raiding cruisers in the Pacific and Atlantic, and a detached squadron in the Far East. But the British fleet reached out to those regions, and, aided by the warships of Japan and France, it drove every vestige of German naval power from the oceans. In the North Sea, therefore, sea power has exerted its greatest, most vital, and most far-reaching effect. There the Germans, if they had possessed the power, could have struck a blow which, if successful for them, would have proved a mortal stroke at the British Empire, and would have rendered useless all the efforts of the Allies. Millions of men, incalculable volumes of guns, munitions, and stores of every imaginable kind for the use of the greatest armies ever set in the field, have entered the French ports solely because the Grand Fleet holds the guard in the North Sea. The whole face of the world would have been changed by German naval victory. England would have been subjected by invasion and famine. If the heart of the Empire had been struck, what would have been the future of its members? If sea communication with the Allies had been cut, what would have been their fate at the hands of the victors? The attacks of sallying cruisers and destroyers upon the coast towns of England, the tip-and-run raids, as they have been called, and the visits of bomb-dropping airships and aeroplanes are the signs of the naval impotence of Germany. The situation in the North Sea is, therefore, of absorbing interest. It may be studied chiefly from the 2 points of view of the strategy of the opposing fleets and the exercise of the blockade. There is a peculiarity in naval warfare, which is not found in warfare upon land, that a belligerent can withdraw his naval forces entirely from the theatre of war by retaining them, as with a threat or in a position of weakness, behind the guns of his shore defences. Nothing of the kind is possible with land armies. A general can always find his enemy, and attack or invest him, and, if successful, drive him back, or cause him to surrender and occupy the territory he has held. The Germans have chosen the reticent strategy of the sea. They have never come out to make a fight to a finish, to put the matter to the touch, to gain or lose it all. The animus pugnandi is wanting to their fleet. It was necessary that they should do something. They could not lie forever stagnant at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven. They could keep their officers and men in training by making brief cruises in and outside the bight of Heligoland. They might, with luck, meet some portion of the Grand Fleet, detached and at a disadvantage. In any case, they were bold enough to take their chances on occasions, always with their fortified ports and mined waters and their submarines under their lee. They might succeed in reducing British superiority by the attrition of some encounters. Such was the genesis of the Dogger Bank battle of January 24, 1915, when that gallant officer, Sir David Beatty, inflicted a severe defeat upon Admiral Hipper, and drove him back in flight, with the loss of the Blücher and much other injury. The same causes brought the German High Sea Fleet, under Admiral Scheer, into the great conflict, first with Sir David Beatty, and then with the main force of the Grand Fleet, under command of Sir John Jellicoe, on May 31, 1916. The events of the great engagement of the Jutland Bank will not be related here. All that it is necessary to note is that the Germans had so chosen their time that they were able to avoid decisive battle with Sir John Jellicoe's fleet by retreating in the failing light of the day, and that their adventure availed them nothing to break the blockade, or otherwise to modify the impotent position in which they are placed at sea. That action operated to the disadvantage of England and her allies in no degree whatever. The superiority of the British fleet as a fighting engine had been placed beyond dispute. The mine and the submarine have put an end to the system of naval blockade as practised by St. Vincent and Cornwallis. No fleet can now lie off, or within striking range of, an enemy's port. Battleships cannot be risked against submarines, acting either as torpedo craft or mine layers, nor against swift destroyers at night. That is the explanation of the situation which has arisen in the North Sea. The blockade is necessarily of a distant kind. There are no places on the British coasts where the Grand Fleet could be located, except those in which it lies, and from which it issues to sweep the North Sea periodically. The first essential is to control the enemy's communications, which is done effectively at the North Passage, between the Orkneys and Shetlands and the Norwegian coast, and at the Straits of Dover. If the enemy desired a final struggle for supremacy at sea, with all its tremendous consequences, he could have it. But he can be attacked only when he is accessible. "There shall be neither sickness nor death which shall make us yield until this service be ended," wrote Howard in 1588. That is the spirit of the British Navy today. But then the Spanish Armada was at sea. It was not hiding behind its shore defence. Be it noted that the Germans, thus hiding themselves, enjoy a certain opportunity of undertaking raiding operations in the North Sea. It is not a difficult thing to rush a force of destroyers on a dark night against some point in an extended line of patrols and effect a little damage somewhere. What advantage the Germans hope to gain by such proceedings is difficult to discover. The magnificence of the work of the British patrol flotillas and the auxiliary patrols must be recognized. In the North Sea these are subsidiary services of the Grand Fleet. Day and night, in every weather, in summer heats and winter blasts and blizzards, when icy seas wash the boats from stem to stern and the cold penetrates to the bone, these patrols are at work. The records of heroism at sea in these services have never been surpassed, and England owes a very great deal to the men who came to her service. The mercantile marine has given its vessels to the state, from the luxurious liner to the fishing trawler, and officers and men have come in who have rendered priceless services. The trawlers have carried on their perilous work of bringing up the strange harvest of horned mines by the score. The patrol boats have examined suspicious vessels, controlled sea traffic, and watched the sea passages. The destroyer flotillas have been constantly at work and ready at any time to bring raiding enemy forces to action. The Royal Navy Air Service has never relaxed its activity and has engaged in countless combats. It has sometimes been wondered why the Grand Fleet did not take some aggressive action. Why did it not attack the North German sea coast, or root out the pestilent hornet's nest of Zeebrugge, which the enemy, by internal communications impregnable to sea power, had provided with the most powerful guns, besides defending it by great minefields. This matter requires to be examined. Naval history abounds with evidence that to attack coast defenses is not the proper or even the permissible work of warships. It is the business of military forces, though naval forces may often assist and even give the means of victory. Moreover, what was once possible is not possible now. Would Nelson have attacked the French fleet at the Nile if it had lain under the powerful guns of these days, and behind minefields, through the secret passage of which submarines could have issued to destroy him? It would be absurd to compare Nelson's attack upon a line of block ships and rafts at Copenhagen, covered by a few forts, armed with old smooth-bores, to an attack upon coast positions defended by modern guns. When old Sir Charles Napier was in the Baltic in 1854, he was denounced at home because he did not destroy Kronstadt or Helsingfors. He rightly refused to play his enemy's game by endangering his ships. Captain, afterwards Admiral Sir B.J. Sullivan, who was with the fleet, put the situation quite clearly in a letter written at the time. A military operation was really required then, as it would be now, to accomplish such a task. We know that 2 guns have beaten off 2 large ships with great loss. Had Nelson been here with 30 English ships, he would have blockaded the Gulf for years without thinking of attacking such fortresses to get at ships inside. Brest, Toulon, and Cadiz were probably much weaker than these places. I suppose there will be an outcry at home about doing nothing here, but we might as well try to reach the moon. But the Navy has never left the Belgian coast secure from attack. It has never lost its aggressive spirit. It has attacked from the ship and the air. The seaplanes of the Royal Naval Air Service spotted for the guns when the monitors were bombarding. Bombs have repeatedly been dropped on Ostend, Zeebrugge, and the places in the rear. When the guns were silent, there were reasons for it. A conjoint naval and military expedition was required. The enemy began to feel his hold on the coast precarious. Continued operations by sea and land might compel him to relax his grasp. Ships may not attack places defended by big guns, minefields, and submarines and destroyers issuing from secret passages through them, but it is certain the British naval offensive will never be paralyzed. Such is the magnificent work of the British Navy in blockading the German fleet, molesting the enemy's coast positions, and controlling his communications with the oceans. The commercial blockade, by which the enemy's supplies and commodities are cut off and his exports paralyzed, is too large a subject to be dealt with here. The object is to bring the full measure of sea power to bear in crushing the national life of the enemy. It is vital but silent work of the Navy, and does not lend itself to discussion or description. Questions of contraband and the right and method of search which arise from the blockade caused discussions with the United States before the States came into the war. The only object of the British Navy and the Foreign Office was to put an end to the transit of the enemy's commodities, and to do so with the utmost consideration for the interest of neutrals, and complete protection for the lives of the officers and crews in their ships and in the examining ships. For these reasons, neutral vessels were taken into port for examination, safe from the attentions of the enemy's submarines. One great hope of the Germans was that the neutrals would become more and more exasperated with England. They remembered that the War of 1812 arose from this very cause. But they were completely disappointed in all such hopes, and they themselves, by interfering with the free navigation of other countries, brought the United States into the war against them. The blockade work of the examination service and of the armed boarding steamers has been extremely hazardous. It has called for the greatest qualities of seamanship, because conducted in every condition of weather, and when storm and fog have made it extremely perilous to approach the neutral vessels, which, moreover, have sometimes proved to be armed enemies in disguise. Hundreds of vessels have been brought into port by the Navy in these northern waters. Sleepless vigilance has been required, and the highest skill of the sea in every possible condition of the service, while the seaman has become a statesman in his dealings with the neutral shipmaster. It has been for the Navy to bring the ships into port, and for other authorities to inquire into their status, and to take them before the prize court if required. The German High Sea Fleet having failed, the submarine campaign was instituted, and began chiefly in the North Sea. It has never answered the expectations of its authors. It has not changed the strategic situation in any degree whatever. Great damage has been inflicted upon British interests, and invaluable ships and cargoes have been sunk, and officers and men cast adrift in situations of ruthless hardship. The tale of the sea has never had a more terrible record, nor one lighted by so much noble self-sacrifice and unfailing courage. End of Part 5. Part 6 of 2 essays on military history, strategy, and tactics, Mountain Warfare, 1909, and Naval Strategy, 1917, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 6. Chapter 3. Sweeping the Enemy from the Oceans. Far flung the fleet then, freeing the seas, clearing the way for men, merchant men these, sinking or flying, broken their power, the enemy dying, left England her dower. J.L. In the foregoing chapter some reference was made to the campaign of the German raiding cruisers and armed liners against British and Allied commerce in the distant waters of the Atlantic and Pacific during the early months of hostilities, and before we go any further, this aspect of the war must be discussed. One object of the enemy was to lead to a scattering of British naval strength, but in this he was wholly disappointed. The distribution of the British fleet remained unchanged, and the great numbers of swift cruisers and armed liners, which had been apprehended as presenting a formidable menace to commerce, made but a feeble appearance. The commerce raiding campaign gave rise, however, to a good deal of alarm at the time, though it surprised no one who understood the means made available by the scientific and mechanical developments of modern naval warfare, and who had studied them in the light of history. The interruption or destruction of the enemy's commerce has always been one of the objects in naval warfare. British floating commerce offered a very large target, and the swift German cruisers, directed by wireless telegraphy and supplied by friendly neutrals, were at work on the lines followed by shipping, making it inevitable that there should at first be considerable losses to the Allies. Admiral Mahon thought that the British total losses in the long wars of the French Revolution and Empire did not exceed 2.5% of the commerce of the Empire. The Royal Commission on the Supply of Food in Time of War expressed the opinion that 4% would have been a more accurate estimate. German cruisers, destructive as a few of them were, did not inflict losses amounting to anything like the figures of the old wars. In those contests of power, notwithstanding the depredations of commerce-destroying frigates, British overseas trade grew, while that of the enemy withered away. If the enemy captured 10 British ships out of 1,000, the loss might be considered serious, but if the British frigates captured 10 out of the enemy's 100, the injury inflicted was 10 times more effective. Towards the end of the long war with France, very few French traders were captured, because scarcely any ventured to sea, while the French continued to capture English ships up to the very end of the war, 10 years after their fleet had been destroyed at Trafalgar. The loss by capture and sinking was at the rate of 500 ships a year, and even in 1810, 619 English ships were lost. In the present war, the German commerce-destroying campaign, by means of cruisers and armed liners, though very effective at the beginning, collapsed with great rapidity. Hostile action against trade has never before been so rapidly brought under control. Steam, the telegraph, and wireless have enormously increased as compared with the sailing days, the thoroughness and efficiency of superior sea power. Difficulty of providing for coal and oil supply, the want of naval repairing and docking bases, and above all the immense superiority brought quickly to bear by the combined naval forces of England, France, and Japan, aided by the Australian Navy, auxiliary to the British to which it belonged, within a comparatively short time caused the whole of German commerce to disappear from the oceans. Soon not a single ship remained, trader, cruiser, or armed liner, as a target, except that such isolated raiders as the Murray might offer rare opportunities of attack. This failure of the Germans seemed the more remarkable because they had long recognized the floating commerce of England to be her Achilles' heel. Prince Bülow described it as such. They had expressly reserved at the Hague Conference the right to convert merchantmen into cruisers on the high seas to serve as commerce destroyers. They used this right in some instances, as in that of the Cap Trafalgar, which was sunk in single ship action by the British converted liner Carmania. Yet this procedure proved of no effect in the war. It would be a great mistake to regard the German cruiser campaign against commerce apart from the general distribution of German warships and the means taken to supply them with their requirements. The writer is inclined to the belief that the impotence of the Germans in distant waters shows that their navy was not ready nor effectively prepared for the war. The great expenditure on the high sea fleet proved unavailing. The submarine boats did not exist in any considerable number. Only about 27 or 28 of them were completed in August 1914, of which about a dozen were of early experimental type, fit only for local use, and the program provided only for the building of half a dozen in each year. The German Navy possessed not more than a couple of big airships and a few effective aeroplanes. The cruisers on foreign service were scattered about the world without plan. The battle cruiser Goeben and the light cruiser Breslau had been detached in the Mediterranean during the Balkan War, and according to the Greek White Book, Turkey having entered into alliance with Germany on August 4th, the two cruisers fled to the Dardanelles in conformity with orders received from Berlin. The Germans were apprehensive as to their safety, and their naval authorities never intended to leave them in their dangerous situation of isolation in an Italian port. The business of controlling and directing the operations of the commerce-destroying cruisers and armed liners, and providing their supplies, was admittedly dexterously arranged by the agency of wireless, mainly through the means placed at disposal by German sympathizers in the United States, the states of Southern America, and other neutral countries, though nothing they did could withstand the steady pressure of sea power. The most considerable German force in distant waters was the East Asian Squadron, under command of Admiral Count von Spee. It was located at Kiao Chau, and its principal elements were the armored cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Sooner or later this squadron was bound to be defeated, as its commanding officer fully realized. The Japanese declared war on August 23rd, and the fleets of Admiral Baron Dewar and Admiral Kato were stretched out to blockade and intercept him. But he extricated himself very dexterously, crossed the Pacific, defeated Admiral Sir Christopher Craddock off Coronel on November 1st, rounded Cape Horn, and was himself defeated with the loss of his whole squadron in the Battle of the Falkland Isles on December 8th. One of his cruisers, the Emden, which had escaped the Japanese, made a great noise in the world. Her captain was a very capable and also a very gallant officer, who bombarded oil tanks at Madras, sank the Russian cruiser Jemtug and the French destroyer Mosquet at Penang, and sent to the bottom 17 British vessels, representing a value of £2,211,000, besides 3 sent into port. The Emden was destroyed by His Majesty's Australian cruiser Sydney at the Cocos Keeling on November 8th. The Karlsruhe sank vessels representing a value of £1,662,000. It is not the purpose here to describe the depredations and ocean wanderings of the other German cruisers or auxiliary cruisers. The object is to show how, by the all-compassing pressure of naval power, they were successively destroyed. It would be folly to deny that there was something defective in the disposition of the British naval forces at the beginning. Admiral von Spee was at large, with 2 powerful armoured cruisers, but Sir Christopher Craddock was left in inferior force off the coast of Chile. The obsolescent battleship Canopus, which had inferior speed, was to join him, but did not reach him in time. The Australian battle-cruiser Australia, which would have been an extremely valuable aid to Craddock's squadron, did not pursue the German squadron across the Pacific. Admiral of the fleet Lord Fisher returned to the Admiralty as First Sea Lord on October 29, 1914, and at once set about to use the naval instrument he had been so largely instrumental in creating. In dead secrecy and with incredible speed, a force was prepared and dispatched. Admiral Sturdee had with him the magnificent battle-cruisers Invincible and Inflexible, the armoured cruisers Kent, Cornwall, and Carnarvon, the light cruisers Bristol and Glasgow, and the armed liner Macedonia. The battleship Canopus was already at Port Stanley. Before anyone knew he had left England, he arrived at the Falkland Islands on December 7th, after having steamed a distance of 7,000 miles. The German admiral was known to be approaching with the object of utilizing the islands as a base. He arrived on the next day, but was taken by complete surprise, though he was conscious of impending fate, and his squadron ceased to exist. This was one of the master strokes of the war, made with lightning rapidity. Strategy was seen in action, and thenceforward the control of the ocean was secured. There remained the business of rounding up the enemy cruisers which were still preying upon shipping on the routes of commerce. Cruisers of sufficient force were dispatched, with instructions to remain at certain rendezvous, each forming a base upon which lighter cruisers could fall back, or to the support of which they could proceed. The lighter vessels cruised on specified curves or lines of search, and in this way a network was spread over the oceans comparable to a spider's web. Thus, in due course, every enemy cruiser and auxiliary was intercepted, or, conscious of the toils which were spread for her, abandoned her task and sought safety in the interment of a neutral port. The Grand Fleet in the North Sea was the master of the situation, and made possible the decisive blow which was struck at enemy power in the oceans. Thenceforward the enemy was impotent in every sea. Not a man could he send afloat to bring aid to his colonies and protectorates. His distant possessions collapsed like a house built of cards. No means had he to interrupt the transport of troops which have brought about the darkening of every German place in the sun. Deutschland ist Weltreich geworden, it was said, but distant possessions are the ripe fruit which falls into the lap of the ultimate sea power, and the Weltreich exists no more. By means of sea power it has been destroyed. The submarine is an effective weapon within its sphere, but no victory has ever been won by evasion, and no sea power can be exercised by stealthy craft which hide beneath the surface of the sea. Part 6. Part 7 of 2 essays on military history, strategy, and tactics, Mountain Warfare 1909 and Naval Strategy 1917 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 7, British Navy, Chapter 4, The Grasp of the Mediterranean, Sea and Land Power. Others may use the ocean as their road, only the English make it their abode. Our oaks secure, as if they there took root, we tread on billows with a steady foot. Edmund Waller, 1656. It is important next to consider the situation in the Mediterranean, and where sea power is of momentous importance to the Allies. In those historic waters, the fate of many nations has been decided. They are a vital link and the highway of the British Empire. Between Gibraltar and Port Said, 2,000 miles of British welfare lie outrolled. To France, with her great possessions in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunis, the importance of this sea highway is supreme. She must, in this war and at all times, traverse its waters, or she will be undone. Italy has won a great position in the Adriatic and the Mediterranean, and she would wither away and perish if either fell under enemy control. Trieste is her object, and she has proclaimed a protectorate over Albania, the better to establish her power in the Adriatic, and she has her new possessions in the Libya Italiana of northern Africa. From the operations in the Mediterranean, we shall learn something more of the relation of sea power to land operations, and of the limitations of that power, and we shall see the allied navies of England, France, Russia, Italy, and Japan in cooperation. We shall know why the enemy made a great submarine stroke in the Mediterranean, when everything else at sea had failed. The French battleship squadrons were concentrated in the Mediterranean before the war. The cruiser squadron in the Channel, like David against Goliath, was willing to encounter even the whole German high sea fleet, but the French had been assured of British cooperation, and all danger was forestalled. In the Mediterranean, the Goeben and Breslau had come west, and had bombarded Bona and Philippeville, but the French admiral, going south from Toulon, was on their heels, and they fled to the east again, running the gauntlet of the British squadron on their way to join the Turks. They had intended to raid the French transports at sea. At this time the French were bringing their troops from Algeria and Tunis, amounting in all to nearly 100,000 men, with guns, horses, mules, stores, ammunition, hospitals, tent equipment, and all the requirements for field service to join the main army in France. It was a great responsibility for the French navy, increased many-fold when troops began to come from their eastern possessions through the Suez Canal. Failure would have meant disaster, but the whole of the transport work was managed without the loss of a man or a horse, and was a wonderful success. It could hardly have taken place with so much security if the British squadron had not been in the Mediterranean, and not at all if the Grand Fleet had not held the German High Sea Fleet fast in its ports by the blockade in the North Sea. From that time forward, for many months, until the Italians came into the war, on May 23, 1915, the French squadron was employed in neutralizing the Austro-Hungarian fleet in the Adriatic, which did not dare to move. The blockading squadron was extended across the Strait of Otranto, with occasional sweeps to the northward to control hostile operations, if possible, at Cattaro and along the Dalmatian coast up to the approaches to Pola, where the submarine Curie was entangled and lost to the Austrians. The French base for these operations was at Malta, but an advanced base was established in the island of Lissa. The blockade was completely successful in checking every effort of the Austrians to strike at the stream of transport in the Mediterranean, though it could not avail to save Montenegro or hold back the Austrians in their advance into Albania. No fleet can operate beyond the range of its guns, unless its flying officers carry their bombs into inland countries. The blockade maintained through the winter at the Strait of Otranto was exceedingly arduous and filled with peril. Enemy destroyers and submarines were at work, issuing from the wonderful island fringe of the Dalmatian coast, and the French knew their peril. The armored cruiser Léon Gambetta was sunk by submarine attack, with the loss of Rear Admiral Senez, who was in command, and every officer on board, as well as nearly 600 men. The armored cruiser Val d'Aigleau suffered damage by torpedo, and the new dreadnought Jean Bart, with Admiral Boulet de Lapierre, the French admiralissimo of the combined fleets, on board, was touched, though only slightly injured. There were other submarine attacks and losses of small craft, and some losses were inflicted upon the enemy. British cruisers were attached to the French flag during these operations, and they continued to cooperate with the French and Italians in Adriatic waters and in the Aegean, where the French and Allied naval forces were the guard of all the operations at Salonika and in the Piraeus. Fleets and armies have cooperated in the Mediterranean from the very beginning of the war. In May 1917, the British monitors, which, with the converted cruisers, have been operating with the military expedition against the Turks and Bulgarians, appeared in the Adriatic and rendered valuable aid to the Italians in their advance towards Trieste. The naval coalition has been a marvel of effective organization. German professors have sometimes said that the land would sooner or later beat the sea, that Moltke would become the victor over Mahan. That is the convinced opinion of the Pan-Germans, who say that the railway will yet prove the more rapid and more secure means of transport than the steamship. The lines from Antwerp by Cologne to Vienna, and from Hamburg to Berlin, and thence to the very heart of Europe to Vienna, and on by Belgrade and Sofia to Constantinople, and from the opposite shore of the Bosphorus to Baghdad and down to the Gulf, and by a branch through Persia to the confines of India, were to give commercial and, perchance, military command of 2 continents. Enterprise by the branch railway through Aleppo and Damascus against Egypt, with a view to further developments in Africa, was related to this conception of land power. The measures adopted by the Allies for the reconstitution of Serbia, the expeditions to the Dardanelles and Salonika, the strong action taken in Greece, the naval movements on the coast of Syria, the operations in the Sinai Peninsula and Palestine, and the expedition from the Persian Gulf to Baghdad were the answer to these gigantesque projects of the enemy. Behind them all lay the working of the fleets. Every class of ship and almost every kind of vessel employed in naval warfare has been used in one or other of these operations: the battleship, cruiser, destroyer, torpedo boat, submarine, mothership, aeroplane, aircraft carrier, mining vessel, river gunboat, motor launch, mine trawler, armed auxiliary, special service vessel, transport, store ship, collier, oiler, tank, distilling ship, ordnance vessel, hospital ship, tug, lighter, and a crowd of other craft. All these are required for the work of the Navy in the Mediterranean, as elsewhere, and they have been employed with a quality of seaman-like skill, enterprise, resource, courage, and success, such as the history of the sea has no previous record of. The appearance at the Golden Horn of a British submarine which had traversed a Turkish minefield was the sign of new powers in naval warfare. We are lost in admiration of the self-sacrifice of officers and men, both of the regular naval service and of the mercantile marine and the fisheries, the latter being the heroes of the perilous work of mine-sweeping. The British and French navies and the vessel representing the Russian Navy acted in the closest cooperation, and all the naval forces worked in intimate association with the armies. Where there was failure, the failure was due to the inevitable limitations of sea power, which has already been suggested with reference to the North German coast, Zeebrugge, and the Montenegrin and Albanian coasts. The history of the Dardanelles expedition will not be written here. Beginning with the bombardment of the entrance forts on November 3, 1914, which had little other effect than to stimulate the defense, continued after an interval of months by the great naval attacks in March 1915, in which enormous damage was done to the forts at the entrance, and to some extent at the Narrows, but with the loss of British and French battleships by the action of gunfire and drifting mines, the enterprise concluded with the landing of the Allied armies in the Gallipoli Peninsula. The troops were compelled by outnumbering forces and concentrated gunfire to withdraw. The combined attack should have been made at the beginning. The unaided naval attack had merely stimulated the defense. Here was the greatest demonstration of which there is a record of the limitation of sea power. In the attack of such a military position, naval forces are essential, but military operations are required if the desired success is to be attained. This is true of all the operations in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. Sea power gave the means by which the army drove back the Turks from Egypt, and it was the support of the advance in Sinai and Palestine. It gave protection to the transports which carried troops and army requirements to Salonika and the Piraeus, patrolling the routes or providing the convoy for the ships. The enemy realized his opportunity, and his submarines began to develop great activity in the Mediterranean. Certain transports were sunk, and an attempt was made to cut the communications of the expeditionary forces with their base. Some considerable losses were suffered thereby, but gradually systems were developed which gave a reasonable sense of security. The British, French, and Italian flotillas were employed, and that of Japan came to their aid. Never had such naval cooperation been witnessed before. We cannot separate the advance in Mesopotamia from the Mediterranean operations, because the same object inspired both, viz., that of arresting the threatened development of German commercial and military power through Asiatic Turkey to the Persian Gulf, and through Persia to the borders of India. The first advance to Kut el Amar and Ctesiphon proved disastrous because undertaken with inadequate means, but the Navy rendered brilliant service, and in the second advance a sufficient river flotilla of gunboats and transports made possible the advance to Baghdad and beyond. The naval flotilla cooperated with most excellent effect in this advance, played havoc with enemy's aircraft, and captured HMS Firefly, which had been lost in the retreat from Ctesiphon. Thus we see the Navy operating in the great central theatre of war and on its outlook to the east, exerting influence, transporting troops, forming the base of armies, and everywhere proving an essential factor in all that was done. It was confronted in the Mediterranean, as elsewhere, with the new weapon of the submarine in very active form. That menace and the campaign against it shall be the subject of the next chapter. End of Chapter 4. Part 8 of 2 essays on military history, strategy, and tactics, Mountain Warfare 1909 and Naval Strategy 1917 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 8, British Navy, Chapter 5, Dealing with the Submarines. My name is Captain Kidd, Captain Kidd, my name is Captain Kidd, Captain Kidd, my name is Captain Kidd, and wickedly I did, God's law I did forbid, as I sailed. Old Nautical Ballad. Having seen the British fleet and the fleets allied with it operating in the North Sea, the oceans, and the Mediterranean, we may suitably turn to some special features of the duties and work of the Navy in the war. The submarine came as a sign and a portent of new developments in the means and the practice of warfare at sea. Regarded once as the weapon of the weaker power, it was adopted into the naval armory of the strongest. when, in 1901, under Lord Fisher's administration as First Sea Lord, a beginning was made in submarine construction by the ordering of 5 Holland boats, many people were taken aback. Confessedly, the part to be played by the submarine lay at that time in the realm of speculation, but the British Navy could not afford to ignore it. Every advance must be watched and studied as it developed. The development has been rapid, and there are British submarines of astonishing powers, which have no equals in the world. They have made their mark in many a theatre of war. The French had led the way, the Germans followed in 1906. There is, indeed, the best reason to believe that Grand Admiral von Tirpitz, Chief of the Navy Department, looked with no kindly eye upon submarine boats. He was a believer in battleships and the creator of the High Sea Fleet, with its battle squadrons and cruiser divisions. Concessions were made to the Admiralty staff, and a few submarines were put in hand, but it was not until the beginning of the war that Tirpitz became inspired with the fervor of the convert. Even now, the relative position of the submarine in the category of warships is obscure. Admiral Sir Percy Scott thought that the knell of the battleship had been rung by its growing power. Yet ships of the battleship class, carrying incredible armaments, possessing speed beyond the dreams of antebellum naval constructors, and infinitely superior for a dozen reasons to anything the Germans had thought of, have recently been completed, and will probably play a decisive part in any future naval engagement. But if the submarine has not dethroned the battleship, she has, in the hands of the enemy, done other remarkable things. She has struck a mortal blow at what many excellent people have hitherto regarded as the settled and accepted code of international law. She has appeared as a pirate commerce destroyer. Without warning and without pity, she has sunk fishing vessels, tramp steamers, stately liners, and hospital ships. The code of honor is not observed by her. The German submarine officer has orders to run no risks, although in the old wars naval officers, who had no means of submerging either to attack or to escape, gladly ran every risk incidental to the service in which they were engaged. When the Lusitania was sunk, it was explained that if the commander of the submarine had permitted the passengers to take to the boats before firing his torpedo, this would have meant the certain destruction of his own vessel. There was no evidence that such would have been the case, but the risk, which implied a danger merely incidental to naval service, was held to justify the sinking of the great liner with 1,200 souls on board. The wildest imagination could not have conceived that any human being could take such a distorted view of right and wrong, and of the plain duty of the seaman. The submarine has accomplished other remarkable things in the war. She has converted benevolent neutrals into resolute enemies. She has brought the United States into the war in support of the Allies. She has transformed the mercantile marines opposed to her into actual fighting forces. A few merchant ships were armed before the war began, but now, because of ruthless submarine attack, the British mercantile marine is for practical purposes embodied with the Navy, in the sense that it is under naval control, is provided with means of defense, and acts directly under naval orders. Moreover, 1/2 or more of its shipping has been taken over by the naval service. The same is true of the merchant ships of the Allies. The German submarine has had a further effect. She has created a whole array of means directed to her destruction. Countless inventors have been set at work, and extraordinarily ingenious methods have been employed with the purpose of putting an end to submarine activities by sinking every boat as she appeared. In the early days of the submarine, it was believed that she might be sunk by using spar torpedoes fixed in swift boats, which would bear down upon the submarine as she submerged and explode the charge against her hull. But it soon occurred to seamen that if a swift vessel, destroyer or other, could run down a submarine, she might more easily sink her by the impact of her sharp stem or a special keel. This method has been practiced in the war, and by this means a number of enemy submarines have been dispatched to Davy Jones' locker. There was an early case in which a certain destroyer, going at high speed, actually impaled a German submarine on her stem, and carried her onward, so injured that she sank. Another early case was that of the German submarine rammed and sent to the bottom off Beachy Head on March 28, 1915, by the Thordis, commanded by that plucky skipper, Captain Bell, who set an example to many. Another plan was to use suitable vessels in pairs, each pair dragging a cable connecting them, from which hung, on short lines, small mines to be electrically exploded when a submerged obstruction, probably a periscope or conning tower, put a tension upon the connecting cable. The disadvantage of this system was that the entrapping vessel could not travel swiftly without bringing the cable near to the surface, and the chance of a submarine fouling the cable was remote. Yet it may be conjectured that the features of this system may have furnished the germ of procedures now in use. Capture or sinking by the use of nets was also an early idea, probably suggested by the nets used by big ships at anchor for protection against torpedoes, and Admiral Sir Arthur Wilson devised a large steel net for the purpose. Possibly this method, too, has developed into the nets employed in dealing with enemy submarines at the present time. But submarines were continually increasing in strength of structure, speed, and handiness, so that new systems were necessary and have developed with the requirements. What the actual methods employed by the Navy are cannot be explained. When Mr. Frederick Palmer, the American writer, visited the Grand Fleet, he asked how the thing was done, and officers said, sometimes by ramming, sometimes by gunfire, sometimes by explosives, and in many other ways which we do not tell. M. Joseph Reinach also visited the fleet, and said in the Figaro that the submarine was pursued by net, gun, explosive bomb, and other means. Squadron Commander Bigsworth, on August 26, 1915, destroyed a submarine off Ostend by dropping bombs upon her from his aeroplane, and there have been several other episodes of the same kind. When the first American transports were attacked in the Atlantic, bombs fitted with a short time fuse were employed, which burst at a predetermined depth below the surface of the sea. The Royal Naval Air Service plays a large part in the anti-submarine campaign. Its seaplanes are always scouting over our waters and sight enemy submarines from afar. Flying high, they can and do discover submarines navigating below the surface, and by wireless or other signals bring destroyers or other craft to the scene, where by special means submarines are destroyed. Probably gunfire is the chief means by which submarines are sent to the bottom. A German submarine may attain complete submergence from the cruising trim within about 3 minutes, but the time may be longer if she has a gun mounted, wireless rigged, and other top hamper. From the awash position, in which her speed is reduced, she may submerge in about 2 minutes. A swift destroyer, knowing the position of such a submarine, may advance toward her, covering a nautical mile within 2 minutes, so that she has an excellent chance of coming within range and putting in shots with effect. Gunnery is carried to a high pitch of proficiency in the Navy, and one destroyer may be mentioned which knocked out the periscope of a German submarine at a range of over 2,000 yards with her first round. There is nothing an enemy submarine likes less than to see destroyers tearing down towards her at high speed as she is getting in her gun, withdrawing her periscope, lowering her masts (often a disguise), and filling her tanks. Moreover, complete submergence may not be a sure protection for her if she is watched, for she may be destroyed by an explosive bomb. German submarines have also learned to fear armed merchantmen, which have not seldom used their guns with effect, sometimes compelling their assailants to submerge, and so evading their attack, and sometimes by obtaining direct hits. The Dunrobin, in September 1916, carried on a lively action for some minutes, hitting her assailant in the vicinity of her conning tower with a TNT shell. thereby causing an internal explosion from which dense smoke arose, followed by 3 common shell, each of them making a direct hit, after which the enemy suddenly plunged at a sharp angle, evidently going to the bottom. In March 1917, the Bellardo was attacked by gunfire from a submarine, whereby her master, chief officer, and a seaman were killed, while her gunners put such shot into the assailant that she was silenced and manifestly disabled. Further, it is not permissible to go on describing how submarines are accounted for. The catalogue of methods is a long one. There could certainly be no single and decisive weapon for the destruction of this new engine of warfare. There is no remedy for the effects of gunfire, and if submarines discover targets possible to be attacked, they will certainly attack them. Some surprise was expressed that the British Admiralty did not at once suppress the submarine menace. When the submarine campaign began in February 1915, it resulted in the sinking of a number of British merchantmen. But having risen to its height, it declined, with fluctuations, until it was described as being well in hand. The methods employed had been successful. Then, after several months, the submarines began their depredations again, carrying them into the Atlantic and the Mediterranean with great violence. They also penetrated the Channel, though they never checked the great stream of transport for the armies between English and French ports, which the Navy was guarding with complete success. The reason for this recrudescence of submarine piracy was the intense energy which the Germans devoted to the production of standardized and powerful classes of submarines, whose parts were produced in many districts of the German Empire. The new boats were practically submarine cruisers, capable of high surface speed, which enabled them to overhaul slow merchantmen, and they were armed with powerful guns. The early enemy submarine carried a 1.4-inch gun, but a 2.9-inch 12-pounder was provided. There is now reason to believe that the caliber has risen to 4.1 inches, and in the case of some of the more powerful boats, to 5.1 inches. These larger guns being shorter and lighter than the same guns mounted in cruisers. But obviously submarines of these classes, carrying on their work over wider areas and in distant places, will not be so easy to destroy as the smaller boats of the early submarine campaign, and this may account for the difficulty in providing a complete protection from the attack. Submarine sections have been sent overland and assembled at Trieste for the Adriatic and Mediterranean, and at Varna for use in the Black Sea, and also doubtless at the Golden Horn or in the Gulf of Ismid. There is much uncertainty about the future of the submarine. She exercises no command at sea, and she makes many fruitless attacks upon armed merchantmen. But she is dangerous, nevertheless. The British Navy has devoted exhaustless energy in applying every possible agency for dealing with hostile submarines, and its great success encourages the hope and belief that the scourge will yet be exterminated. Destroyers, motor launches, patrolling ships of many classes, seaplanes, observation balloons, and other craft are at work every day, and many of them every night. But whatever element of uncertainty there may be as to the complete success of these agencies, there is none in the conclusion that the submarine will never bring England, still less her allies, to the verge of famine or anywhere near it. Scarcity of food is not due so much to the submarine as to the great demand on the world's supplies, and the enormous volume of shipping absorbed by the naval and military requirements of England and her allies. The Navy, which has done such wonderful work in the war, is not and will not be ineffective against the submarine. Chapter 6. The Navy and the Mine. They sink, they slink, they seek the boat, grisly horns stuck through their skin, ready to sink all things that float, these villain boxes shaped of tin. The fisher sees the death therein, but reaches down with his long fling, and grasps the chain that holds them in, and draws the fangs they hoped would sting. Anonymous. The British Navy fights for the great ideals of the people, acting upon the lines of old and loyal traditions, but while doing so it has encountered the desperate devices of the enemy, who has used the latest achievements of scientific and mechanical invention in such a manner as to overthrow many preconceived methods and accepted conventions of naval warfare. We have already spoken of the submarine. Now we shall see what the mine is and how it is dealt with by the Navy and the services the Navy controls. It has been said, with much truth, that the essence of war is violence, and that moderation in war is futility. It is also true, as we see, in the cruel operations of Zeppelins and bomb-dropping aeroplanes, and not less in the attacks of submarines, as directed by the Germans and their allies, that the non-military populations suffer the horrors of war in much greater degree than was the case in the wars, even of recent times. But the Germans, at the very beginning of the war, outraged neutral sentiment by employing ostensible merchant and passenger vessels flying neutral flags, and without giving warning to the neutrals, in the deadly work of scattering mines indiscriminately in the open sea on the main lines of trade. They acted in direct contravention of the rules of war as previously accepted. These disguised mining vessels had traversed the trade routes as if pursuing peaceful purposes, thus enjoying the immunities which had always been accorded to innocent neutral vessels, and yet they had wantonly endangered the lives of all who traversed the sea, whether neutral or enemy. The Admiralty were soon able to declare publicly that this mine-laying under a neutral flag, as well as reconnaissance conducted by trawlers and even by hospital ships and neutral vessels, had become the ordinary methods of German naval warfare. The later history of the war shows how far the Germans were prepared to go in casting off any restraint in their efforts to do injury to their enemies. They compelled the British Admiralty to adopt counter-measures. For years past, the Germans had devoted unremitting attention to the study and practice of mining and the production of very powerful types of mines. In that respect, they were undoubtedly ready. The state of war between England and Germany began at 11 p.m. on August 4, 1914, and on the morning of the next day German mines were being laid on the east coast of England. The Königin Louise, a former Hamburg America liner of 2,163 tons, was caught in the act off the Suffolk coast and was sunk by the light cruiser Amphion and the 3rd Torpedo Flotilla. On the next day, the Amphion herself, the first British warship destroyed in the war, fell a victim to the mines she had laid. This disguised mine-layer had initiated a practice, which has since been many times followed in the war, of throwing mines overboard in the track of pursuing vessels. It was resorted to by the retreating Germans in the Battle of the Dogger Bank. Here it may be remarked that the Germans have always claimed the right to subject every consideration to their necessity to win, though at the Hague Conference in 1907, Baron Marschall von Bieberstein, the German delegate, said that conscience, good sense, and the duty imposed by the principles of humanity would constitute the most effective guarantee against abuse, and he proclaimed, "Je le dis à haute voix," that German naval officers would always fulfill, in the strictest fashion, the duties which emanate from the unwritten law of humanity and civilization. Any technical description of German mines would be out of place here, but it may be said that generally they approximate to a spherical shape and are provided with projecting horns, almost in the shape of drumsticks, concussion with which is calculated to break a small vial within, whose contents cause the detonation of the enormous charge of TNT explosive. Each mine is provided with a sinker, which drops to the bottom and is attached to the mine by a cable or sounding line paid out by special mechanism to any desired length, whereby the mine may be kept at the intended depth below the surface. There are other types of mines, and in particular one of cylindrical form, containing a prodigious quantity of explosive and capable of the widest destruction. This has probably been used only in special situations. The ordinary mines can be laid with great rapidity by a specially fitted mine layer, provided with rotary gear, bringing mine after mine along a special track to the dropping position. The drifting mines, which the Germans at the very beginning of the war set afloat in the main trade route from America to Liverpool via the north of Ireland, can be laid with still greater rapidity. When mine laying in British waters by surface boats was made extremely risky or almost impossible, the Germans resorted to the employment of submarine mine layers, one of which was exhibited in the Thames. Vessels of this class, so far as they are known, probably carry a maximum of 12 big mines in 6 chutes or airlocks, the lower mine in each chute being released by means of a lever, after which the other drops into its place, ready to be let go in the same way. The boat exhibited in London and elsewhere was of a rough, rudimentary character, indifferently built, and her speed was probably not more than 6 or 8 knots. Undoubtedly, many of the submarine mine layers are of better type. They are constantly at work, especially on the east coast of England, and some losses have resulted, but the effect of their operations is nearly always overcome by the means adopted by the Navy. The first measure set on foot by the Admiralty is to organize a system of search for suspicious craft, and to declare the North Sea a war area, within which it was dangerous for any vessel to navigate, except through channels indicated by the naval authorities. The Germans replied with their now famous and futile blockade order of February 1915. New regulations were issued from time to time, regulating navigation through the British minefields, and the result has been, in association with the patrols, to exercise a very close supervision over the navigation in home waters. As to distant mining operations of the enemy, the First Lord of the Admiralty stated, on March 8, 1917, that they had been carried very far, and the P&O liner Mongolia, sunk off Bombay on June 23, 1917, was not the only vessel mined in the Arabian Sea. From time to time it has been announced that mails for and from the East and Australia have been lost at sea. It is an inspiring thing to turn from the picture of mines and the scattering of them by the enemy to another picture, that of the gallant and successful manner in which the Navy and the mine trawlers and other vessels embodied in its service and employed in the ceaseless patrols have grappled with the deadly menace of the mine. Ever patrolling the British coast, ever facing death, often speeding to the help of vessels mined, torpedoed, or otherwise in distress, the glorious men who man these craft have inscribed their names in letters of gold on the roll of British honor and fame at sea. It was a marvelous thing, this embodiment of the vast mine-sweeping and patrolling service in the work of the Navy in the war. From all the coasts fishermen have come, with their trawlers converted from the craft of winnowing fish at sea to the sterner work of bringing up and destroying the strange harvest of deadly mines which endanger all life at sea. Many a trawler has been sunk by contact with her fatal captures. Others have been sunk by hostile fire and bombing by enemy aeroplanes, but never have the brave seamen quailed in the service of the country and the Allies, and in every port men are to be met whose craft have been sunk under them, and who have hastened to sea again. Hundreds of ships, drawn from the mercantile marine and the fisheries, steam yachts, motor boats, armed launches, and vessels of other classes, are employed in such dangerous work. They share the trials of war, wind, and weather with the regular naval patrols. Sir Edward Carson, when First Lord of the Admiralty, directed attention to the magnificent work of the mine trawlers of these patrols. The force employed at the beginning of the war numbered about 150 small vessels, but increased to 3,000 or more. The whole nation should understand what minesweepers were doing. The thousands of men engaged in this operation are the men who are feeding the whole population of this country from morning till night, battling with the elements as well as the enemy, facing dangers under the sea. A minesweeper carries his life in his hands at every moment, and he does it willingly. Later again, he expressed his thanks and the thanks of the nation for the splendid work they had accomplished. Of all the seamen who had so deservedly earned the gratitude of the country, none had had more arduous and dangerous duties to perform than the gallant fellows in the patrols. They have worked in reliefs day and night at sea, though sometimes driven to port by the fury of the elements, and they brave every kind of weather. As Admiral Bacon, commanding the Dover Patrol, has said, with reference to the security with which thousands of merchantmen had passed through the waters in his patrol, no figures could emphasize more thoroughly the sacrifice made by the personnel of the patrols and the relative immunity ensured to the commerce of their country. They have trawled for mines not only in British but in distant waters. Their magnificent work under fire, and attacked by bomb-dropping aeroplanes at the Dardanelles, will never be forgotten. An American correspondent, Mr. Gordon Brace, who sailed in a mine trawler to learn its work, concluded an article in the New York Tribune in these words: "I looked at those men who go out day after day, who wear their life belts continually, who take their tea on the decks while they peer over the rims of their cups for the death that lurks in those somber waters. I thought how fine was their devotion to their duty, how great a part they are playing in the war, out there alone, where their deeds are attended with no sounding of trumpets, where they give to their work the same quality of bravery as is required of the man in the trenches. And as I glanced at the inscription over the cabin, which read, 'England expects every man to do his duty,' I knew that England would not be disappointed." The practical methods by which the Navy and its brave mine trawlers conduct their services are of great interest, but description cannot go too far. The enemy is certainly well acquainted with all British methods previous to the war, but mine-sweeping systems do not stand still, but develop with the progress of armaments generally. Mine trawling is developed from the system of trawling for fish, which before the war had reached a high degree of technical efficiency, and in the application of that system to their work in the war, the men have attained great proficiency and become extraordinarily successful. The trawl net varies in size with the dimensions of the vessel using it. An average size would be about 100 feet in length, with a spread of from 80 to 90 feet. The principal features in fishing trawlers are fore and after frameworks, with fair leaders, a towing block, a powerful steam winch, and towing warps. A trawler would pay out hundreds of fathoms of heavy wire warp, the handling of which called for great skill and dexterity. It was not a very difficult thing to adapt this method of trawling to the sweeping for mines. The fishing trawler goes unaided, but in mine sweeping the trawlers work in pairs, and the towing warp is replaced by the sweeping wire. Two trawlers, steaming abreast at a certain interval, drag a weighted steel hawser which, upon striking the mooring of a mine, brings the deadly catch to the surface, where it is exploded by gunfire from a destroyer or by rifle fire from an armed trawler or motor boat. The mine-sweepers have encountered perils and hardships which have never been recorded, and fishing trawlers pursuing their peaceful occupations have often incurred the same risks. Next, after the destruction of the enemy's fighting vessels, comes the destruction of his death-dealing mines, and the mined trawlers, confronted with an unparalleled task, attended with extreme peril, have rendered magnificent service to England and her allies. End of Part 8. Part 9 of 2 essays on military history, strategy, and tactics, Mountain Warfare, 1909, and Naval Strategy, 1917, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 9, British Navy, Chapter 7, The Navy and Army Transport. What of the mark? Ah, seek it not in England. A bold mark, an old mark, is waiting over sea. Where the string harps in chorus, and the lion flag is o'er us, it is there our work shall be. Sir A. Conan Doyle. The stupendous and scarcely calculable operation of transporting by sea the enormous armies which are employed in many theatres of the hostilities is the index and measure of the greatest of all the triumphs of naval power in the war, namely, that of establishing and maintaining a central command of the sea. Against this bulwark the enemy's naval forces have battled in vain. The submarine may, in some degree and in some circumstances, affect command of the sea, but it cannot exercise it. It is difficult to realize all that the transport of millions of men, organized as armies and provided with all that armies require, has meant to the Allies, or to bring home to ourselves a full sense of what the responsibilities of the Navy have been in safeguarding them. The armies of Frederick and Napoleon were pygmies compared with the vast hosts which are set in the field today. When Frederick invaded Silesia, he had with him not more than 30,000 men. The motley army with which Napoleon invaded Russia, the greatest that had ever been brought under a single command, did not greatly exceed 600,000 on a liberal computation. Wellington in the Peninsula never commanded 50,000 men. But in March 1916, Mr. Balfour, then First Lord of the Admiralty, said that 4,000,000 combatants had already been transported under the guardianship of the British fleet, with 1,000,000 horses and other animals, 2,500,000 tons of stores, and 22,000,000 gallons of oil, for British use and the use of the Allies. In January 1917, Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, First Sea Lord, said that over 7,000,000 men had been transported, together with all the guns, munitions, and stores they required. 6 months later, when the United States troops began to arrive, the figure may be estimated to have reached 10,000,000. The victory of Germany would have been swift and decisive if the great armies represented by these figures had not come to the support of France. French troops from northern Africa and the East also joined her brave army, because transport in the Mediterranean was secure. The great army of Russia could have made no offensive movement if she had not received the immense supplies of guns, munitions, motors, and other materiel which came to her from abroad. Because of British supremacy at sea, and the shipping that consequently came there, Archangel, from being a sleepy harbor, developed into one of the busiest ports on the continent of Europe. Italy could have made no headway if many of the things she required had not come to her by sea. Greece would have remained permanently on the side of the enemy if sea power and the troops transported there had not rallied her to the Allies. The German colonies would not have been occupied if fleets had not carried to them the troops for their subjection. England, by virtue of sea command, guaranteed by her fleet, has gathered her armies from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and from every colony and possession, and has sent them to serve in France, Belgium, Greece, Gallipoli, Egypt, Palestine, Macedonia, Mesopotamia, and Africa. Not a soldier has gone afloat, but a seaman has carried him on his back. Before we can appreciate this aspect of the work of the Navy in the war, we must gain some idea of what is implied by the military service of these armies in the field. It is not enough to dispatch armies. They must be maintained and supplied. The communications of an army are vital to its operations, and the communications of all the armies that England is employing are by sea, and are guarded by the Navy. It would not be an easy thing to estimate the vast requirements of fighting forces, but that is unnecessary. They are on an infinitely greater scale, in proportion to the strength of the troops employed, than in any previous war. Guns are far more numerous and much heavier than they were. The expenditure of ammunition has gone beyond all anticipation, and a real fleet is required for its transport. Horses, mules, many descriptions of heavy and light ordnance and ammunition for them, warlike and general stores of innumerable kinds, aeroplanes, balloons, the gigantic tanks, hospitals and hospital requisites, clothing, food, forage, camp equipment, transport vehicles, traction engines, pontooning, railway, telegraph, building and mining material, locomotives of many kinds, petrol, and 100 other stores and things are necessary, and they must day and night be in transit, without rest or pause. It will illustrate the gigantic nature of the operation if we record that between November 1916 and June 1917, 2,000 miles of complete railway track were shipped, with nearly 1,000 locomotives and other supplies by railway companies. Labor and work for 100 different services have to be provided also. The United States and other countries have contributed enormous supplies, and with the coming of the American Army, the volume of the ceaseless torrent, the veritable Niagara, will increase still more. History has no parallel for such operations. This vast business being the charge of the British Navy and of the navies allied with it, we see how great an object it must be of the enemy to strike at the lines of supply. That they have completely failed would appear almost miraculous if we did not know that the reasons for the failure are altogether of a practical character. It was inevitable that there should be some losses when submarines and mine layers were at work, but the destruction effected has been a mere fraction of the whole, and the influence upon the campaigns is entirely negligible. The Ministry of Munitions imports 1,500,000 tons of materiel every month. The most considerable loss due to attack has been in the matter of shell components, but it did not amount to more than 5.9% of the whole supply from the beginning of the submarine campaign up to June 1917. The most serious disasters were in the Mediterranean, where submarines sank the French transports Province II and Gallia, and engaged in the Salonika expedition, with the loss of about 1,600 lives. The enemy will certainly continue his efforts. Never was a more seriously planned attempt made than that of June 22, 1917, when General Pershing's American Expeditionary Force was crossing the Atlantic. German submarines, in considerable force, made 2 attacks upon the transports, and on both occasions were beaten off with every appearance of loss. One submarine was certainly sunk, and there was reason to believe that the accurate fire of the American gunners sent others to the bottom. For purposes of convenience, the expedition had been divided into contingents, each composed of troop ships and a naval escort, designed to keep off such raiders as might be met with. An ocean rendezvous was arranged with the American destroyers then operating in European waters, in order that the passage through the danger zone might be attempted by every possible protection. There was reason to believe that the Germans had secret intelligence of the course taken by the transports to the rendezvous, and of the time appointed for their arrival there. The first attack occurred at 10:30 p.m., at a point well on the American side of the rendezvous, in a part of the Atlantic which might have been presumed free from submarines. The heavy gunfire of the American destroyers scattered the enemy boats, and 5 torpedoes were seen. The second attack was launched a few days later against the other contingent on the European side of the rendezvous. Not only did destroyers hold the boats at a safe distance, but their speed resulted in sinking at least 1 submarine. Bombs were dropped, firing a charge of explosive timed to go off at a certain distance under water. In one instance, the wreckage covered the surface of the sea after a shot at a periscope. Protected by our high seas convoy destroyers and by French war vessels, said the Secretary of the United States Navy, the contingent proceeded, and joined the others at a French port. The whole nation will rejoice that so great a peril has passed for the vanguard of the men who will fight our battles in France. This incident illustrates the method of protection chiefly employed by the British Navy. When the original expeditionary force was sent to France, the Grand Fleet was in readiness if the High Sea Fleet should venture to issue to sea. Cruisers, destroyers, naval aircraft, and submarines were on watch and guard in the North Sea and the Channel, and the patrol was maintained, day and night, without intermission, until the army had been effectively transported. The patrol was then organized upon a greater scale as the transport grew in volume. The Dover Patrol undertook a work of the highest importance, and was instrumental in holding off all destroyer attacks from the eastward. Cruisers, destroyers, armed motor launches, mine trawlers and drifters, and other vessels have been constantly at work, and observation balloons and seaplanes have never ceased their vigil. The triumph has been complete. The enemy's submarines have never penetrated the Guard, and the Channel communications of all the armies in France have been made secure. There are certain features of this organization which cannot be dealt with here. The same system has been carried into the Mediterranean and elsewhere, and the French, Italian, and Japanese navies have shared in the work. In this matter of transport protection, the British Navy has rendered magnificent service to all the Allies. General Sir Charles Munro, after the evacuation of Gallipoli, said it was a stroke of good fortune for the Army to be associated with a service whose work remained throughout this anxious period beyond the power of criticism or cavil. And General Sir Ian Hamilton reported that one tiny flaw in the mutual trust and confidence animating the two services would have wrecked the whole enterprise. This is true not only of Gallipoli, but of every place in which the Navy has been serving as the guard of the communications and the base and support of the military forces. It will be understood that the Transport Department of the British Admiralty undertook a colossal work at the beginning of the war. It possessed the unrivaled experience gained during the South African War (1899 to 1901), when about 275,000 men were dispatched and supplied with all Army requirements over a distance of 7,000 miles of sea and land. Then there was no enemy afloat, but the operation was greater than any previously undertaken, and evoked the admiration of the world as a revelation of resource, energy, organization, national spirit, good management, and businesslike capacity. What will be said when the now incalculable work of the Transport Department in this war can be estimated and described? The inspection and selection of ships and the conversion of them for the accommodation of troops and horses was a great business. In 1899 it was estimated that a satisfactory transport should be capable of carrying a number of men equal to 25% of her tonnage. What is the rule now one cannot say. There are important considerations of ballasting, speed, coal consumption, and other matters in such business, and the removal or adaptation of existing fittings and the allotting of space for various purposes have occupied the Admiralty officers and officials. It was a business both of embarkation and disembarkation on both sides of the Channel, and special provision was required for the wounded and sick. The naval transport and embarkation officers have had a very exhausting and anxious time in taking up, fitting, coaling, and otherwise preparing vessels for sea, and in giving orders for the movements of ships at the ports on arrival and departure, as well as in providing for the safety and expedition of all embarkations of men, horses, and stores, and arranging for docking and like matters. They merit the gratitude of the country and the Allies. It may be said that in all the naval and commercial ports of the United Kingdom, and in the French ports as well, work of this or like kind has been in progress uninterruptedly since the beginning of the war. It is strictly naval work, and has set on an excellent and satisfactory footing by the Admiralty. But as the war progressed and the pressure grew greater, imposing additional duties on the Transport Department, some matters dealt with by certain of its branches, and concerned with ship construction, modification, and repair, were placed in charge of competent civilians. Chapter 8. The Navy that Flies. Heard the heavens fill with shouting, and there rained a ghastly dew from the nation's airy navies grappling in the central blue. Tennyson. From an account of the work of the British Navy in the war, there must not be omitted some exposition of the gallant doings of the men of the Royal Naval Air Service. They have made their mark in the war, in every theatre of it, and no one can tell what part they will play before the struggle is at an end. Of some of their work very little is known. They render silent service, like that of the Navy to which they belong. They do not always carry on their duty alone. On occasions they participate in that of the Royal Flying Corps of the Army. They have been associated with the gallant French airmen, and the Americans come with a new burst of energy. The Germans know British naval airmen at Zeebrugge and Ostend, and in all the country behind those places. At sea also, when the German raiders return from their exploits, and on the west front of the army too, where they go at times far behind the line, spying out the land, taking number and note of the enemy, dropping bombs on his store and ammunition dumps, disturbing all his rearward services, and stirring up his aerodromes and the nursing places where his fledglings, whom they call quirks, are taking to themselves wings and learning to fly. The Royal Naval Air Service has lent its aid to the Italians, has provided unpleasant experiences for the Bulgarians, has dropped bombs on the Turks at Gaza and thereabout, has rendered good service in the Mesopotamian business, and was invaluable in spotting for the guns which destroyed the fugitive German cruiser Königsberg in the jungle-clad reaches of the Rufiji River. From dawn to dusk these knights of the air have been flying in many parts of the world, and night flying is their particular pleasure when there is great work to be done. Their game book is very full of astounding episodes of fighting, which, in exciting experiences, put into the shade the thrilling narratives which for generations have delighted the hearts of boys. Few people know the sleepless vigil which the naval airmen keep all round the British coasts, constantly flying to keep watch upon the enemy, to spot his submarines, to discover his minefields, and to defeat any efforts he may make when transports are moving at sea. Such is an outline of the occupation and duties of the Royal Naval Air Service. There was an Air Department at the Admiralty before the war, and a Navy wing of the Royal Flying Corps, with its Central Air Office, its flying school at Eastchurch, and seaplane and aeroplane stations at 6 places on the coast, as well as airships at Farnborough and Kingsnorth. At the Royal Inspection at Spithead of the great mobilized fleet just before the war, naval aeroplanes, seaplanes, and airships gave a fine display. Development was rapid. The Royal Naval Air Service came into independent existence, and there is now the 5th Sea Lord at the Admiralty charged with the supervision of the Royal Naval Air Service and representing it on the Air Board. Some of the most useful work of the Royal Naval Air Service is in spotting for the guns of the warships. Its officers made a methodical photographic survey of the coast from Nieuwpoort to the Dutch frontier early in the war to assist the monitors which were then bombarding the coast, and to observe and correct their fire. They worked from a height of about 12,000 feet, constantly observing the development of the enemy's gun emplacements, all in despite of hostile airplanes and shells. That survey has been continued, and the result is the finest thing in aerial cartography which has ever been achieved. It will illustrate this part of the special work of the seaplanes if we describe how they began, which we are enabled to do by a lively-witted official scribe who examined the records of their operations and has given his impressions. "I can't see where they're pitching," said the Navy that floats, referring to the shells of the monitors bursting 12 miles away. "What about spotting for us, old son?" "That will do," replied the Navy that flies, "and more also, but I shall have to wear khaki because it's done out there, by everybody apparently." "Wear anything you like," replied the Navy that floats, "as long as you help us to hit those shore batteries. Only, because you wear khaki, the Royal Naval Air Service does not usually wear khaki, and sea life, don't forget you're still the same old Navy as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. The Navy that flies added Amen, and said that it wouldn't forget. Wherever its squadrons were based, they rigged a flagstaff and flew the white ensign at the peak. They erected wooden huts and painted them service gray, labeling them mess deck, wardroom, gunroom, etc., as the case might be. They divided the flights into port and starboard watches, and solemnly asked leave to go ashore for recreation. They filled in shell holes and leveled the ground for aerodromes. They ran up hangars and excavated dugouts, whither they retired in a strong silent rush (the expression is theirs) when the apprehensive Boche attempted to curtail their activity with bombs. Not all the good work of the Royal Naval Air Service in its cooperation with the fleet comes into public notice. It rendered excellent service at the Dardanelles, the seaplane carrier Ark Royal being present. There were many fine achievements, including the bombing of a transport in the Straits by Flight Commander C.H.K. Edmonds, Royal Navy. Seaplanes may take the place of scouting cruisers as the eyes of the fleet and relieve destroyers of some of their scouting duties. What would Nelson not have given for the help of seaplanes when he was crying out for frigates and was groping for the French in the Mediterranean in 1798, and came unknowingly within a short distance of them? Or again, when in 1805 they eluded him off Toulon? Intelligence of the movements of our enemy is of the utmost importance to officers commanding at sea, and this is the service which the naval airmen have been rendering. At the beginning of the war, the Germans enjoyed an advantage in the possession of some dirigible airships which sailed in calm airs, unimpeded, over the North Sea, surveyed its full extent, and reported what they saw to the German naval authorities. Their number rapidly increased. Thus the British fleet was to a certain extent hampered in its operations. Now the situation is changed. The enemy's airships know the peril of coming within range of anti-aircraft guns, and they dread the Hornets which carry special means of setting them on fire. There are British airships, too, and observation captive balloons, fixed and towed, as well as seaplanes, maintained in adequate numbers. The seaplane played a useful part in the Battle of the Jutland Bank, and craft of the class will astonish the enemy in any subsequent naval engagement. The dropping of bombs by the seaplanes or aeroplanes of the Royal Naval Air Service has become the most prominent of its activities. The machines are of great power, and, acting in numbers, they have been able to drop an enormous weight of bombs on the enemy positions, particularly in the districts behind the coast of West Flanders. Within the space of 4 or 5 months, 70 tons of explosives were dropped on the German aerodromes in northern Belgium. Brave naval airmen in July 1917, from a height of 800 feet, dropped bombs on the Goeben and other enemy warships at the Golden Horn, and hit the Turkish War Office also. In this work the young officers, for the service demands youth, have given proof of exceeding keenness. It would be difficult to catalogue the expeditions of the naval airmen on the Belgian coast. They have assisted in most important operations. How far such work may be continued, to what range carried, or what will be the full effect, we do not know. The Navy that flies will leave nothing undone that is capable of accomplishment. It has operated in association with the work of French flying men on many occasions, at the bombardment of Zeebrugge and elsewhere. It will find a powerful co-worker in the new and gallant Allies who are bringing all their forces to bear from beyond the Atlantic. The United States Air Service will develop with extraordinary rapidity, and its cooperation will be warmly welcomed by British naval airmen. So abundant is the confidence of Americans, so strong and virile their faith in themselves, that some of them look to the aeroplane to end the war. Rear Admiral Bradley A. Fiske has demanded an immediate naval attack on the German fleet and submarine bases in the Baltic by a monster fleet of aeroplanes and seaplanes. He believes that the importance of naval aerial operations is not sufficiently realized by the Allies and that Essen may be destroyed by bombardment from the air. The field of speculation does not fall within the scope of this little book, the object of which is to illustrate the work of the fleet and its associated services in all the theaters of war. The Royal Naval Air Service is still young and has undoubtedly a great future. Already it has proved a valuable auxiliary. It has assisted in the important business of providing complete strategical observations. It has aided the work of the commercial blockade in making more easy, on many occasions, the operations of the much-tried examination service. Undoubtedly, the transport of the armies and their stores across the Channel and in many seas, which was the subject of the last chapter, would have been conducted with less certainty and perhaps with less confidence if it had not been for the active cooperation, as the eyes of the fleet, of the naval flying men. The long-range gunnery of warships against permanent fortifications, both at the Dardanelles and on the Belgian coast, has gained in accuracy from the observation by the aircraft of the Navy. This subject might have been pursued further, but enough has been said to show that among the agencies employed by the British fleet in the accomplishment of the supreme duties which it exercises for the safety of the country and the support of the Allies, the Royal Naval Air Service holds an important place. It has evoked enthusiasm among its officers, who have maintained in a high degree, in many a battle in the air, the fearlessness, resource, and daring of the naval service to which they belong. End of Part 9. Part 10 of 2 essays on military history, strategy, and tactics, Mountain Warfare 1909 and Naval Strategy 1917 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 10, British Navy, Chapter 9, Officers and Men of the Navy. Sailor, what of the debt we owe you? Day or night is the peril more? Who so dull that he fails to know you, sleepless guard of our island shore? Safe the corn to the farmyard taken, grain ships safe upon all the seas, homes in peace and a faith unshaken, sailor, what do we owe for these? The late Viscount Stuart. No picture of the war work of the British Navy could be complete without some account of its officers and men. From what has already been said, the nature of the qualities demanded of them will have been realized. In the general direction of the Navy by the Admiralty, there have been required calm reflection, profound insight, strategic imagination, sound and swift judgment as to the full use and the yet ill-understood limitations of sea power, an abundant spring of action, and the unflinching resolution to give effect to the utmost to the striking and controlling force of the naval arm. In the Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet there was needed the high ability to administer and exercise the command, to inspire officers and men of every rank and rating in the fleet with zeal, efficiency, and devotion, as well as sleepless vigilance in the long waiting for the enemy, and instant readiness for action at all time. The Commander-in-Chief does not work alone. He has a staff who collaborate in these duties and give effect to his plans, and admirals secondary in command who have no light task in directing the work and operation of the larger elements of the fleet. Sir John Jellicoe, who was appointed to the Grand Fleet at the beginning of the war, was a master of the high attainments required for his office, and it was he who created the base of his operations, organized all the agencies of his command, and exercised that command with consummate ability. The instrument he had shaped and handled so capably fell to the charge of Sir David Beatty, a most gallant officer, eminently fitted to use it, whose temperament is the very very spirit of action, and yet who forms his plans in the mould of cool reflection. Happily for the British Navy, the fire of action is mingled in its officers with the ice of thought. They know when to strike, and when they strike hard. Great responsibilities have rested on the captain of His Majesty's ships. They showed in the Jutland battle, in which they were tried by the searching test of decisive action, that they possessed the ability to inspire and discipline their men, and to put forth the maximum of the fighting power of the ships. Officers in detached command away from the fleet have rendered very great services. The junior officers are beyond praise. By universal testimony, their devotion, courage, and ever-ready professional skill in every test of emergency and endurance have never been excelled. The officers of the destroyers are men above price. The commanders of submarines, who have even carried their enterprise into the Baltic, and risked the perils of mine and gun in the narrow waters of the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, are officers who have won new laurels for the fleet. The men of the lower deck, wherever they serve, give daily proof of the bravery, hardihood, cheerfulness, and long endurance which have always been the qualities of British seamen. Let Sir John Jellicoe speak of them as he knew them. Nothing can ever have been finer than the coolness and courage shown in every case where ships have been sunk by mines or torpedoes. Discipline has been perfect, and men have gone to their deaths not only most gallantly, but most unselfishly. One heard on all sides of numerous instances of men giving up on these occasions the plank which had supported them to some more feeble comrade, and I feel prouder every day that passes that I command such men. During the period of waiting and watching, they are cheerful and contented in spite of the gray dullness of their lives. It would not be difficult to single out instances from the records of the war of constructive power in thought and sound and swift judgment in action, as well as of the splendid courage, enterprise, dash, and resolution, call it what you will, in the crisis of battle and in moments of stress, exhibited in a manner rarely exampled in naval warfare. The British fleet has been rich in the mental endowments of its officers, showing them to possess grasp and insight and moral force, to dominate hesitation and sustain action in the tremendous emergencies of battle, and when confronted with the most formidable responsibilities. Excitement has never carried them away. Judgment has worked through all their endeavors, as in the long watches and waiting it has sustained them. Eulogy is not required. Nothing that has been said exceeds the merits of officers and men. It is right that these things should be understood. The man is more than the machine, and the finest fleet and most complete material equipment are dead and inert without the living power of the officers who command, and the men who man the ships and vessels of every class. It is they who have done and are doing the work of the Navy in the war. They, and not their ships, have given security to the British Isles, have kept the seas and oceans open for the Allies, have safeguarded every interest afloat, and have worked and are working day and night to defeat the purposes of the enemy. We now turn to a consideration which is of paramount importance for a right understanding of the Navy's work in the war. England is the support of all her continental allies. If she should suffer or lose her power of supplying them with armies and arms, or should weaken in her offensive, the allies would collapse. This is a fact of primary importance. The Germans realize it fully. They hesitate at nothing in their efforts to strike at England. They publicly declared that they would reduce her by famine. They struck at her mercantile marine, not merely at ships which were armed and engaged in the naval service in such large numbers, but at the ordinary cargo vessels, including neutral vessels carrying British supplies, and at fishermen pursuing their regular avocations, who under the Hague Conventions were, with their boats, tackle, rigging, gear, and cargoes, to be exempt from capture, and still more from destruction. Of the officers and men of these services we must speak also. It became necessary, in the conditions which had arisen, to bring the whole mercantile marine under naval direction and orders, and practically it is embodied with the Navy, and provided for the most part with armaments for defense, and closely in touch with a great protective organization. When Mr. Balfour was First Lord of the Admiralty, speaking in the House of Commons on March 7, 1916, he directed special attention to this aspect of naval work, not merely to the service of ships flying the white ensign, but to that of transports and of merchant and cargo vessels and their officers and men, conveying imports and exports and the supplies required by the Allied armies. On them, he said, we depend, not less than on our armed forces, for maintaining the necessary economic basis upon which all war must ultimately be waged. There were, as he said, thousands of officers and men whose ships had been sunk under them by mine and submarine, and yet who had cheerfully signed on again, and were not to be driven from their ancient heritage of the sea. England depends upon her mercantile marine for her national existence. To a great extent her food and raw materials are in its charge, and it also brings without ceasing hundreds of thousands of tons of munitions of many kinds required by the Allies. When, therefore, we estimate the work of the Navy in the war, we must give to the merchant branch of the sea service the position it deserves as an absolute and primary necessity to England and her allies. The nobility of the work carried on by the officers and men of the merchant service and the fishermen, whether in armed ships, mine trawlers, or cargo vessels, is a dominant note of the war. Their heroism has been conspicuous, and, as was stated by Admiral Sir Henry Jackson when he was First Sea Lord of the Admiralty, the facility with which they learned to carry out their duties as part of a trained fighting force was extraordinary. The Allied nations, he said, owe them a deep debt of gratitude for their response, as well as for their indomitable pluck and endurance. There is no room in the Navy for anything but the most sincere admiration and respect for the officers and men of the mercantile marine, said Sir John Jellicoe. They had practically become a part of the fighting force, sharing in the work of the Navy in the war, and their courageous conduct and unflinching devotion to duty have gained the testimony of naval officers everywhere, not only in the British service, but in the Allied navies which have come into contact with them. Of the magnificent service of the mine trawlers we have spoken in a previous chapter. Let this chapter conclude with an appeal to England and her allies to remember the great and enduring services of British seamen. They do not often speak of one another. Sometimes, as by a flash, as when Sir John Jellicoe wrote of his men, the truth is revealed. It was that taciturn old officer, Sir John Jervis, who said of Troubridge that he had honour and courage as bright as his sword. The torch is handed on from one officer to another. There are many qualities among them. The fire of Drake meets the resolute gravity of Blake. The long reflection of Kempenfelt is the foil to the fierce glow of Nelson. The tradition is continuous. Sir John Jellicoe could find no words to do justice to his officers and men in the day and night actions of the Jutland battle. The glorious traditions of the past were worthily upheld. Sir David Beatty showed his fine qualities of gallant leadership, high determination, and correct strategic insight. Great qualities were manifested by every rank and rating. Down in the engine rooms, seeing nothing of the battle, men were working like Titans, and some ships reached speeds which they had never before attained. This was great service for England and her allies. There is sometimes a tendency to forget, to lose proportion also, in censuring seamen for not doing what the power of the sea alone can never achieve. Howe was burned in effigy in London almost at the very time when he was fighting his glorious battle of Quiberon Bay, braving the perils of rocks which were charted and known, and not, be it noted, of submarines and mines which are invisible and unknown. As the sarcastic songster wrote at the time, "When Hawk did bang, Monsieur Conflans, you sent us beef and beer. Now, Monsieur's beat, we've naught to eat, since you have naught to fear." And so Nelson spoke. "I will only apply," he said, "some very old lines wrote at the end of some former war. Our God and sailor we adore in times of danger, not before. The danger past, both are alike requited. God is forgotten, and the sailor slighted." Now, the object of this book is to show what are the services of the British Navy to England and to the Allies. Its influence has been visible throughout the world, working everywhere with unexampled success. It operates solely because of the qualities and sacrifices of its officers and men. To them a high tribute must be paid. Chapter 10. What the British Navy is and what it fights for. Where shall the watchful sun, England, my England, match the masterwork you've done? England, my own. When shall he rejoice again? Such a breed of mighty men as come forward 1 to 10 to the song on your bugles blown, England, down the years on your bugles blown. W. E. Henley. Antagonism between England and Germany became the central fact in the international situation many years before the war. There seemed to be a fundamental antithesis between the ideals of the two peoples. The freedom of the Englishman, guaranteed to him by sea power, appeared effeminate and undisciplined weakness to the German. The freedom of the German, guaranteed to him only by the military strength of his autocratic state, was regarded as feudal dependence by the Englishman. Not to bring about a conflict, but to avert one, or, if the worst came to the worst, to engage in one with success, was the motive of British policy. There was no visible ground for German aggression, but deep-seated antagonism was the element of danger which successive premiers and foreign ministers had had to take account of in appraising their country's future, and with the guidance of their colleague at the Admiralty, who based his judgment on that of his naval advisers, they had obtained the means to build up the fleet, which was to be the country's and empire's defense. Armageddon was foreseen, though there was hope against hope that in the great crisis the dire struggle might be averted. It was known that Belgium and France would have need of England if the dogs of war were let slip. Many soldiers and writers had pointed out that Belgium would become the inevitable pathway of aggression. German writers had declared it an injury that the Congress of Vienna had not established Germany on the North Sea, and Arndt had expressed the ardent desire of the German heart to reconquer the great western rivers, implying the domination of the seas. There were dangers in these lesser countries. They were full of possibilities. Qui trop embrasse mal étreint. Belgium would cry aloud for English help. As to Italy, it was difficult to believe that she could hold to her compact with the Central Powers. Russia, it was known, would be against them. Thus, in all her naval efforts, long before the war, England, while guarding her own interests, was working and building up her naval strength in conscious knowledge of the duty she might one day have to her friends, who might now become her allies. This is a very important point, and it leads to a brief survey of great sacrifices and unstinted efforts which Englishmen have made in the past. The fleet that went into the war was the most powerful, best organized, and best equipped in every essential particular in the world. Yet for a very long anterior period, Englishmen had remained unconscious of what they owed to the fleet. They had fought brilliant campaigns in China, Afghanistan, India, Burma, the Crimea, Abyssinia, and elsewhere, in which the Navy was a most essential factor, though it had scarcely appeared in the public eye. It was therefore from a low ebb that the British Navy rose to the high water mark of the war. It was not until about the year 1882 that the tide began to turn, driven forward by the lively breeze of a very useful agitation, in which the late Mr. W. T. Sneed took a prominent part, and which is believed to have been inspired by the present Lord Fisher and the late Mr. Arnold Forster. A great shipbuilding scheme was put in hand in 1889. Ever since that time, under far-seeing First Lords and First Sea Lords of the Admiralty, the task of asserting British naval supremacy has gone forward. Expenditure on the Navy mounted from £31 million in 1901 to £51,500,000 in 1914, which latter was thought a monstrous figure, but it was not a penny too much for the great interests which had to be safeguarded. Battleships of increased power, cruisers of many classes, destroyers, submarines, and auxiliaries were built. Lord Fisher came to the Admiralty as First Sea Lord in 1904, and during the subsequent 6 years an enormous work was carried on. The battleships culminated in the dreadnoughts, that class of ships with a main armament of all big guns, the cruisers in the battle cruisers, destroyers grew more numerous and of much greater power, submarines were developed in range and sea-keeping qualities. None of these types have stood still. The dreadnought developed into the super-dreadnought, and the latter has developed into the ships of powers before undreamed of, which no one has yet described. The submarine has been changed out of recognition, and no one suspects what these British vessels can and will do when the day really comes. All these mechanical developments of the fleet, which are so essential at the present time, grew out of the impetus given in and after the year 1904. But that was not the only thing which placed the country in such a position of advantage at the beginning of the war. The battle fleet and cruiser squadrons had been reorganized to coincide with the needs of the Empire, owing to the shifting of the stress of naval power from the Atlantic and the Channel to the North Sea. Some squadrons in distant waters were reduced in strength to correspond with the requirements, and non-fighting ships, vessels too weak to fight and too slow to run away, were brought home from distant seas, and their officers and men were made available for modern ships. A system of nucleus crews was adopted for the reserve ships to facilitate mobilization and to make sure that the ships would be really fit for sea. Before that time the whole fleet had been pivoted on the Mediterranean, and a British warship was rarely seen in the North Sea. By progressive steps the naval front was changed from the south to the east. On the east coast of the United Kingdom, destroyer and submarine flotillas were based on ports prepared for them. A great dockyard was erected at Rosyth, and all along the coast naval bases were developed, and every preparation was made for the possibility of war. These were developments of great significance, and the immense and growing strength of the British fleet justified the French in concentrating their battle squadrons in the Mediterranean, and leaving at Brest and in the Channel only a division of cruisers supported by flotillas. Fleets of warships are meant to fight when the need for fighting comes. But there was no affront to Germany, no cause for resentment or agitation, in the concentration of the main strength of the British fleet in such places, and with such bases, that they could carry their power into the North Sea. Force attracts force in strategy as in physics, and the growth of the German high sea fleet at Wilhelmshaven, with the great sea canal thence to Kiel on the Baltic, inevitably brought about the British concentration. How magnificently advantageous was the position secured has already been shown. In an earlier chapter it has also been explained that by the strategic position occupied by the Grand Fleet, and the grip held on the entrance to the Channel at Dover, the North Sea became strategically a closed sea, a marum clausum. This fact, which is a fact of geography as well as of strategic concentration, has made the enemy restive and resentful. We are described as the tyrants of the seas, and the freedom of the seas became a catchword of the Germans. Every ruler who has felt the hard pressure of British sea power, whether his name was Louis or Napoleon or Wilhelm, has perhaps inevitably taken this line in denouncing us to neutrals and endeavoring to array neutrals against us. In an earlier stage of the present war, this was the consistent plea of German statesmen. But when they instructed their sea officers to sink Lusitania and many other ships, and when they threatened with disaster neutral ships which approached the British Isles, they became themselves the tyrants of the sea in a very real sense, and they thus arrayed the United States and other states against themselves, and brought a new armada to strengthen the already superior British fleet. The war is a fight for freedom. The British Navy is fighting, and glad to have the Allied navies fighting in coordination with it, for the liberation of oppressed nations and countries from military domination. Command of the sea implies no restriction of navigation. It exists only in wartime. In time of peace, the British Navy guaranteed the freedom of the seas, and will guarantee it again when the war is at an end. We cannot do better than quote on this question what the distinguished American writer Admiral Mahon said: "Why do British innate political conceptions of popular representative government, of the balance of law and liberty, prevail in North America from the Arctic Circle to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic to the Pacific? Because the command of the sea at the decisive era belonged to Great Britain. In India and Egypt, administrative efficiency has taken the place of a welter of tyranny, feudal struggle, and bloodshed, achieving thereby the comparative welfare of the once harried populations. What underlies this administrative efficiency? The British Navy, assuring in the first place British control, and therefore communication with the home country, whence comes the local power without which administration everywhere is futile. What, at the moment when the Monroe Doctrine was proclaimed, ensured beyond peradventure the immunity from foreign oppression of the Spanish-American colonies in their struggle for independence? The command of the sea by Great Britain, backed by the feeble navy, but imposing strategic position of the United States, with her swarm of potential commerce destroyers, which a decade before had harassed the trade even of the mistress of the seas. In concluding, therefore, we see how the British Navy, having served Great Britain and the British Empire so efficiently and so well in every interest and possession, fighting constantly against every stealthy device of the enemy, has served the Allies not less well and worthily. And we discover, too, that the Navy is ever friendly to neutral powers, and that the command of the sea which it exercises in the war is the panoply of freedom and liberty throughout the world. End of Part 10. End of 2 essays on military history, strategy, and tactics, Mountain Warfare, 1909, and Naval Strategy, 1917, by Various.